The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.
Good afternoon, colleagues. We're going to start this afternoon's business, as usual, with time for reflection. And our time for reflection leader today is the Reverend Dr. Alistair May from DL St Andrew's Parish Church in Motherwell. Reverend Dr. May.
Good afternoon. I urgently needed a spare set of keys to give to a tradesman the next afternoon. I only had one key. So the last minute, I went to the local locksmith shop. I don't have the type, he said, but if you leave the key with me, I'll order one and it'll be ready at 10:30 tomorrow. So I agreed. 10:30 the next morning, I came back. The shop was closed. I phoned the number on the board outside. It rang out. I came back at 11:30, at 12:30, but the same. It was shut and I was absolutely raging. I didn't even have my own key now. So I was going to have to cancel the tradesman and all the plans. At 1 o'clock, I tried one last time, and the shop was open. The key cutter said to me, "So you're the guy from yesterday?" "Yes," I said. "I called at 10:30, 11:30, 12:30, but you were closed." "Oh," he said, "the delivery didn't come at 10:30. I knew it was important to you, so I shut my shop and I went across Glasgow to get your key. Here it is." Well, needless to say, I felt about 2 inches tall. Sometimes life preaches a sermon at you, and Presiding Officer, thank you for letting me share this sermon with you today. The conclusion, well, aside from trust small traders perhaps, we assume the worst in people. We assume they don't care. We attribute the worst of motives. We can't even seem to disagree without disparaging, and well, social media makes it 10 times worse. St. Paul writes of love that it is patient and kind and not easily angered. But he goes on to say this: love bears all things and it believes all things. Love believes all things. I really struggle with that. Believe the best about one another. Give each other the benefit of the doubt. It can seem terribly naive, even gullible. And, well, I'm a Calvinist. We're supposed to believe that all people are sinful, their motives are always crooked. And yet, Calvin wrote of love believes all things this: a Christian will consider it better to be taken in by his own kindness and good nature than to cause harm to his brother through ill-founded suspicion. So maybe it is better to be naive than to be cynical. As Paul wrote that, I'm sure he had Jesus in mind. Jesus who saw the whole person, the whole situation. Jesus who reflected the love of God. And the Bible says of God, he is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. Abounding in love and slow. I leave you with the parable of my Rutherglen locksmith, but with the thought that we might start with the assumption that the other person may be doing their best in situations that we don't understand, and the humility to consider that perhaps it's us that's got it wrong.
Dr. May, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, colleagues. We're going to move on to our next item of business, which is topical questions. And our first question is from Daniel Johnson.
To ask the Scottish Government how the effectiveness of the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine in Scotland compares with the rest of the UK.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
By 8:30 a.m. today, 610,778 people have received the first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine since the 8th of December. Yesterday, 34,881 doses were administered in Scotland, a 55% increase on the previous Monday. The JCVI was clear that to be as effective in preventing mortality from COVID-19, the initial focus must be on older care home residents. In Scotland, 98% of older care home residents have had their first dose. Northern Ireland are reporting a similar proportion, and up to yesterday, almost 76% of older care home residents in Wales have had their first dose. England have reported that they have offered doses to all care homes, but there is no publicly available information on the proportion actually administered. The rationale for prioritising delivery in the way we have is clear. Age is the greatest risk factor, and the COVID-19 Actuarial Response Group has reported their estimates that 20 older care home residents would have to be vaccinated in order to prevent one death from COVID-19. That figure increases significantly as you go down the ages. The purpose here is to prevent death and serious illness as far as possible, and so our prioritisation for the JCVI group is the right approach to take.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for her answer. There has never been a policy intervention as universal in its delivery, nor so profound in its importance as the COVID vaccination rollout. As a consequence, what people want and they deserve is straightforward answers to the plain facts. They do not want SNP ministers and Conservative ministers in Scotland and England pointing the finger at one another, nor dancing on the head of statistical definitions. The plain fact is that Scotland has vaccinated 12.7% of our population compared to 14.8% in Northern Ireland, 16.1% in Wales and 17.8% in England. Scotland has the lowest vaccination rate across the devolved nations and indeed the English regions. The Scottish Secretary has also claimed that 500,000 vaccinations remain in storage and have not been called down by the Scottish Government. What we do not want is vaccine nationalism or flag waving, but the simple answer to the simple question, which is this: why are we behind? What is being done to catch up? And are we vaccinating enough people each day?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm grateful to Mr Johnson for his supplementary question, and there's at least two things in what he has said that I completely agree with him. I don't think people want politicians pointing fingers at each other either, and I do believe that we need to vaccinate faster in Scotland than we have been doing, and I think the plans that are in place from this week onwards significantly increase those numbers. However, the additional point that I would make, and I will come back to those plans in a moment, the additional point I would make is I actually disagree. I think the Scottish Secretary of State's numbers are wrong. However, I'm not going to get into a debate about that because we deliberately, consciously, and in a spirit of cooperation, agreed not to publish numbers, not to publish figures, in order to respect commercial confidentiality and the wishes of the UK Government. You cannot square that position with the Secretary of State for Scotland constantly appearing on broadcast media and print media, quoting numbers that we apparently are not allowed to respond to. Simple point I would make is he's wrong. He's wrong about that number that he says are in storage. We have done a number of things, and later in this week I will be writing to all members of this Parliament and to all Scottish MPs, explaining the changes in the supply delivery approach that we're taking, the number of additional sites, both local and the super centres, for example, Louisa Jordan, EICC, that are being stood up, where we are going in terms of the vaccination of the over 70s and the clinical extremely vulnerable, and how we will meet the target that we've set, that they should all be vaccinated by the middle of February, as well as now opening up vaccination slots for those over 65, and we will then move into those over 60 and those who have underlying health conditions. All of that detail will be set out for MSPs later in this week, along with their own list of the centres in each board area that are providing vaccinations, both in addition to GP surgeries. Some are small, depending on the geography, some are large, but what we have tried to do is minimise the amount of travel that any individual has to undertake in this first 4 cohorts that any individual has to undertake in order to be vaccinated, because we want to encourage maximum take-up and minimal obstacles in their way.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but can I urge both the Secretary of State for Scotland and indeed the Scottish Government to get a grip of this? Numbers are out there, and this disagreement is causing confusion. So please can we have clarity, given that numbers have already been publicised? But it's also critically important that we have clarity in the process, progress and the targets. But NHS Lothian are now claiming that the data for over 80s vaccination programme that is being delivered by GPs is not included in the weekly figures published by Public Health Scotland. And that came a week after the same health board stated that guidance was not clear. We also have significant variance in rates between health boards. So again, people want simple answers to these basic queries. Do Public Health Scotland figures capture all those vaccinated? Are some health boards doing better than others, and why? And given that we missed the target of 1 million vaccines by the end of January, how many people will have been vaccinated by the end of February?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there's a number of points in there, right? And let me start with them and go through them one by one. First of all, on the question of data, I couldn't agree with Mr. Johnson more. And in fact, at the most senior level, between Michael Gove and our First Minister, the agreement was reached that the 4 health ministers of the 4 nations of the UK would find out an agreement on what data we would publish and what we wouldn't. We would not publish future supply, but what could we agree on to publish? That had no sooner been reached than the Secretary of State was out there talking about numbers. So I have written to my counterparts, Mr Hancock, Mr Gethin and Mr Swan, with a proposition about what we publish and how, so that we get rid of confusion about numbers, because I completely agree that that is important. In terms of your point, there is a time lag with some GP data. When we vaccinate anywhere other than in GP practices, we use the vaccine management tool, which produces the numbers downloaded for us on almost a 2-hourly basis. GPs, not all GPs, some are on the vaccine management tool, but not all are, and they upload their data at the end of the day. That can mean a time lag between what we have at 8:30 in the morning and everything that has come in from all the GP practices. We're working right now to try to resolve that so that the time lag is minimised as far as possible. There has been variation, quite significant variation between boards. That is reducing as we sit with each board, looking at their plans, their numbers, and identifying where the variation is unacceptable and that we need them to do more. So, for example, NHS Ayrshire and Arran were planning clinics to do cohorts 3 and 4 too late in the month. And they've taken down that information from their website as they replan those clinics and bring them further forward. So we're doing as much as we can, looking in great detail at what each board is doing and making sure that they are communicating clearly with those that they're responsible for, but that where there are things that need fixed, like the distribution and supply of vaccines across Scotland, that we're taking steps to improve that. Where data is lagging, that we take steps to improve that. And where we can't make that better, we explain that clearly. And as I said earlier, a lot of that detail, once we have resolved it, will come to MSPs across this chamber, but also to our Scottish MPs later in this week. And I hope this week that we will be able to reach an agreement across the 4 nations about what data we do publish and then what data we stick to.
Thank you. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Looking to the future, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what plans are in place for prioritisation of vaccines for those who sit outside the JCVI priority cohorts? Can she indicate which, if any, public sector workers will get priority?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the JCVI is currently considering itself what advice, if any, it wants to offer the 4 nations after the priority groups have been completed, those down to 50 and over. So we are waiting to see what they want to say to us, if they want to offer any advice at all. Meantime, there is some thought going on inside government as we wait for that, but at this point it is too early to reach a conclusion, particularly as we look to see how the new strain performs, the new strain which is increasingly becoming the dominant strain. So the Chief Medical Officer's Advisory Group is keeping an eye on all of this. The JCVI is giving some thought to whether or not what should there be, if any, prioritisation once we reach the under 50-year-olds in terms of sectoral groups or what it might be. And once we have that advice from them and we've reached a view, we will of course make sure that this chamber is aware of that and also aware of the reasoning behind it.
Thank you. And Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, the National Clinical Director said today that the vaccination programme is not a race. However, the First Minister has said repeatedly that we're in a race against the vaccine. I hope it is a race, and I hope we win that race, because that way we'll save lives. So can she clarify whether we are going as fast as possible to win this race?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the First Minister was absolutely right. It is a race against the virus. And a virus that increasingly, as we see, is more infectious than it was this time last year. We're almost a year now. And so there is a race. The race is twofold. One is to vaccinate as quickly as we can those JCVI groups. But the other part of that race is to put as many obstacles in the way of the virus being transmitted from one person to another, which at the moment we do not know that the vaccine will do that. That will be the actions and behaviours of all of us in terms of complying with restrictions to minimise the virus's opportunity to transmit itself from one person to another. And as I said earlier in response to Mr Johnson, I want us to go faster in vaccinating the adult population and that JCVI group in particular, because we know that the more of those individuals that we vaccinate, particularly at the older end of that, the more deaths we are likely to prevent. So every day we are looking in detail at what more can we do, how much faster can we go. Some of the steps are already in place to make sure that we have removed some of the obstacles to our pace, but there will undoubtedly be more to do, and I can assure the member and all the other members that I personally look at that every single day, and that our First Minister is very alert to all the actions we're taking, but also to challenging us to do much more.
Thank you. And question 2, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what impact there will be on the Crown Office budget as a result of payments of compensation to individuals involved in the administration and liquidation of Rangers Football Club Limited following the admission they were victims of malicious prosecution.
And so I should have said before calling Mr Fraser, this is still a live issue, so members and I'm sure the Minister will be careful in their response not to make any comments which would impinge on that. Minister, Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
Presiding Officer, and that's why I'm answering the member's question as Cabinet Secretary for Finance, because his question specifically asks about budget and any legal element of a specific case is rightly for the Lord Advocate. Last week, I outlined the budget for 2021-22, including the Crown Office and Procurement of Fiscal Service budget. It is now for the Justice Committee to scrutinise the COPFS budget. Arrangements have been made so that the settlement of these cases, including those referred to in Murdo Fraser's question, will not affect the operational effectiveness of the COPFS. They will not require to be met from the COPFS resource allocation, which I announced as part of the budget last week.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This case is an absolute scandal. Innocent individuals were treated like terrorists. They were arrested, taken from their homes, held in police custody, risked imprisonment and financial ruin when they had committed no crimes and there was no evidence of any significance against them, as a consequence of what the Lord Advocate has now admitted were prosecutions motivated by malice. This is what we might see in Putin's Russia, not in 21st century Scotland. And to make matters worse, if we are to believe media reports, David Whitehouse and Paul Clark have already been paid the sum of £24 million in taxpayers' money, with other claims still pending. At a time when businesses and individuals are crying out for more COVID support, that is simply outrageous. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if you can confirm that these payments have in fact been made?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I understand the emotion in Murdo Fraser's question, and as I already said, any questions about the legal implications of this case are for the Lord Advocate. Arrangements have been made so that these settlements will not affect the service provided by the Crown Office to victims and witnesses. And Murdo Fraser also highlighted other budget lines, and I can also assure him that they do not affect other budget lines. The Lord Advocate wrote to the Justice Committee yesterday and advised them that the actions in the Court of Session at the instance of Mr Clark and Mr Whitehouse are still pending before the court, and a hearing in the action brought by Mr Whitehouse will call later this week. On the disposal of the respective proceedings brought by Mr Clark and Mr Whitehouse, the Lord Advocate will be able to provide an update.
Murdo Fraser.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, though she did not respond to my actual question. And while it is indeed the case this matter is still before the court, it is a very minor procedural matter that still needs to be disposed of, and I think the taxpayers are entitled to know whether £24 million of our money has been paid to these individuals, as I understand it, with a tax indemnity which could substantially increase the sums paid. But these are very serious issues here to be addressed. It is essential that there is public confidence in the justice system and in the prosecution system when we see catastrophic failures which could amount to corruption. Does the Scottish Government now accept the only way to get the answers here is to have a full, independent, judge-led public inquiry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what I can say is that, subject to the agreement of the Parliamentary Bureau, the Lord Advocate intends to make a statement to the Scottish Parliament in this respect at the earliest opportunity, and I'm sure Murdo Fraser will have the opportunity to put further questions at that point.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And on that note, we're going to end topical questions, and we're going to move on to the next item of business, which is a statement from the First Minister on COVID-19. Could I encourage all members who wish to ask a question following the First Minister's statement to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I will update Parliament on Cabinet's review of the current lockdown restrictions. The review took place earlier today. Let me say at the outset that, with a limited but very important exception in relation to some early years and school education that I will come on to later, the Cabinet has decided that the current lockdown, including the stay-at-home except for essential purposes requirement, does need to remain in place until at least the end of February. In the course of this statement, I will give an update on the current state of the epidemic, which provides the context for that decision. I'll also give an update on the vaccination programme, and I will set out some of the additional measures we intend to take to get and keep the virus under control in the months ahead. And finally, I'll set out how and when we hope to begin the process of getting children back to school. Firstly, though, let me cover very briefly the latest statistics. There were 758 positive cases reported yesterday. That is 7.4% of all tests carried out, and means that the overall number of confirmed positive cases is now 181,291. 1,939 people are currently in hospital, which is a decrease of 19 from yesterday, and 143 people are in intensive care. That's the same number as yesterday. I also regret to report that over the past 24 hours, a further 69 deaths were registered of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days, and the total number of deaths under this daily measurement now stands at 6,181. And yet again, I want to send my deepest condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one. The level of COVID infections clearly remains too high. That is evident from these figures. However, the most recent figures provide further evidence that the lockdown restrictions are working to improve the situation, and that is, I believe, positive. Average daily case numbers have more than halved in the past 3 weeks. In the most recent week, up to 29th January, an average of 1,062 confirmed new cases were reported each day. 3 weeks ago, the average daily number was more than 2,300. Weekly case numbers per 100,000 of the population have also fallen from 302 in the week ending the 8th of January to 136 in the most recent week. Test positivity has reduced as well. In the 7 days up to 29th January, it averaged 6.6%. That is still higher, but it is closer than it has been in recent weeks to the 5% that the WHO considers to be indicative of an outbreak being under control. Now, pressure on the National Health Service does continue to be severe. The number of COVID patients being treated in hospital remains around 30% above the high point of the first wave back in April last year. However, hospital admissions in this wave do appear to have peaked on the 12th of January. They have now stabilised and are starting to reduce, albeit slowly. ICU numbers at this stage are more volatile, but they did not reach the peak of the first wave, and they also appear to have peaked in this wave and to have done so on the 18th of January. So all in all, the statistics do show real progress. However, this progress is down to compliance with the lockdown restrictions, and I want to thank everybody across the country for that compliance. However, the situation does continue to be fragile. Case numbers still remain higher now than they were in the week before Christmas. That means that if we were to ease restrictions too quickly, there is a real risk that infections would rise again very quickly. That risk is, of course, increased by the fact that the new variant of COVID, which is more infectious, now accounts for, we estimate, around 73% of all new cases in Scotland. I can also advise Parliament that Public Health Scotland is examining evidence suggesting that there may be an increased risk of hospitalisation of people infected with this new variant. However, at this stage, there is no statistically significant evidence of any increased risk of death. Public Health Scotland is continuing to analyse the evidence on both of these points, and we will keep Parliament updated. I can also advise Parliament that to date there have been 5 cases of the new South African variant identified in Scotland. However, all of these have links to travel, which means that there is no evidence so far of community transmission of that variant. All of what I've just set out underlines the need for continued and very extreme caution in our fight against COVID, especially if, as I think we all do, we want to get some children back to school later this month. That is why Cabinet has reached the conclusion that the lockdown restrictions must stay in place until at least the end of February. However, if our progress continues, then I am cautiously, and I stress cautiously, optimistic that as more and more people get vaccinated and with the protection of some of the additional measures that I will set out shortly, we may be able to begin looking towards a careful and gradual easing around the start of March, and I will give an update on that in 2 weeks' time. Let me now report on the progress of the vaccination programme. I can confirm that we have, as of this morning, given a first dose of the vaccine to 610,778 people in Scotland. That includes 98% of all residents in older care homes, which is a truly extraordinary uptake, and 83% of the number of over 80s we estimate to be living in the community. I'm going to return to that point shortly. In addition, I can advise that 21% of over 75-year-olds have already received the first dose, and we are on track to have vaccinated with the first dose all over 70-year-olds and all adults who are classed as being especially clinically vulnerable by the middle of this month. Vaccination of the 65 to 69-year-old age group is also underway from this week, and those aged 60 to 64 and unpaid carers will start to receive appointments from the third week of February. So we are making good progress in protecting those who are most at risk from COVID. Nevertheless, I expect there will be legitimate questions today about the overall number of vaccinations in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK. That is reasonable. However, I would make two initial points at this stage. Firstly, we have been very deliberately trying to achieve as high an uptake as possible in the top priority groups, and we believe we are achieving a higher uptake than elsewhere. So, for example, we haven't just offered vaccination to all older people in care homes, we have achieved an actual uptake of 98% amongst residents and 88% among staff working in older people's care homes. And that really matters in terms of reducing the burden of illness and deaths. Similarly, in the over-80s group, the 83% I reported earlier is based on a cohort number that we think is overestimated. The work we have been doing with health boards to refine these numbers suggests that the actual uptake amongst the over-80s group is already closer to 90%. These uptake figures are way beyond anything achieved in the flu vaccine programme, and vaccinating the most vulnerable to the greatest extent possible is really important, even if it takes more time to do so. It will help to save more lives. All of that said, though, it is clearly the case that overall volumes matter too, and that leads to my second point. As we make more use of mass vaccination centres for the younger age groups, we expect the daily rate to also increase. The figure reported today, for example, shows just under 35,000 first-dose vaccinations were done yesterday, reflecting in part the opening of new centres. That is the highest daily number so far, and it is 55% higher than last Monday. So, having achieved greater depth in the programme so far in the form of high actual uptake in priority groups, our challenge now absolutely is to accelerate on breadth in the form of numbers overall, and that is what we are doing. It is right, of course, that all of this is subject to close and ongoing scrutiny, and we will continue to provide the daily figures that allow that to happen. Now, as we continue to suppress the virus within our own borders and increase the protection of the vaccine, it is essential that we also guard against fresh importation of cases from overseas. This is particularly important as the virus mutates and new, more infectious and potentially more severe variants emerge. And as we look ahead, we must learn from past experience. We now know, for example, that by early July last year, we had almost eliminated COVID in Scotland, but then allowed it to be reseeded from, in the main, overseas travel. We must guard against that happening again. It is to that end that the 4 UK nations have already agreed that travellers coming into the UK from countries with a travel ban in place will be required to quarantine in hotels. That is a necessary measure, but in the Scottish Government's view, it does not go far enough. Firstly, there should be very few people coming from countries with a ban in place anyway. Second, this approach leaves open the possibility that people will travel into the UK from those countries via third countries. And thirdly, an approach that to manage quarantine that only includes countries where new variants have already been identified is too reactive, because often by the time a new variant has been identified through genomic sequencing, it will already have spread across borders. So the firm view of the Scottish Government is that in order to minimise the risk of new strains coming into the country, managed quarantine must be much more comprehensive. I can therefore confirm today that we intend to introduce a managed quarantine requirement for anyone who arrives directly into Scotland, regardless of which country they have come from. Obviously, we cannot unilaterally implement immediate managed quarantine for people who arrive in other parts of the UK before travelling on to Scotland, so we will continue to urge the UK Government to adopt a similar comprehensive approach. However, if they don't wish to do so, as is entirely their prerogative, we will ask them to work with us to reduce the risk amongst people travelling to Scotland via ports elsewhere in the UK. And we will set out more detail of how and exactly when the managed quarantine system will be operational as soon as possible. I understand how tough restrictions are for our travel and aviation industry as well, of course, as they are tough for individuals. So we will also look to work with the UK Government to ensure the sector gets the support it needs until such time as we are able to start to ease travel restrictions. It is vital, as I've said, that we guard against the importation of new cases, but it is also crucial that we continue to identify cases and break chains of transmission here in Scotland. We're already increasing the accessibility of testing, for example, by increasing the number of mobile test facilities that are available, creating additional local and regional test centres and making more use of fire service stations for testing in rural areas. Today, I can set out a further expansion of regular routine testing of those without symptoms. Firstly, we will from later this month widen the regular testing of healthcare workers so that it covers primary care workers in patient-facing roles, such as GPs, dentists, optometrists and pharmacists. From mid-February, regular testing will also be available to all staff who work directly with patients in hospices. We also intend to expand the availability of regular testing in other healthcare settings, such as addiction and mental health services. And we will introduce targeted testing to support some essential public service functions, including emergency service control rooms and NHS 24. Staff and patients in certain health settings obviously face an elevated risk of transmission, which is why it is right to have such a focus on those settings. However, we know that there are some industries which also have higher transmission risks, such as food production and distribution. So we are working with businesses in those sectors with a view to introducing routine testing for their workforces over the course of this month. Alongside these proposals to test people whose work potentially puts them at risk, we will be expanding targeted community testing, where testing is made available to everybody in a local area, regardless of whether or not they have symptoms. This can play a particularly valuable role in communities where prevalence is stubbornly high or where it is starting to rise again. In recent weeks, local councils have been submitting proposals for community testing, and we've been considering these in light of the lessons from the pilot projects conducted at the end of last year. Community schemes have already been agreed across 7 local council areas within the health boards of Fife, Grampian and Ayrshire and Arran. By the end of this week, we will have agreed community testing plans across the majority of mainland local authority areas. And in addition to that, mobile testing units are already being used for targeted community testing in Ayrshire and Arran, Dumfries and Galloway, Scottish Borders and Forth Valley. These testing units, which are offering tests to people regardless of whether or not they have symptoms, are already finding cases on a daily basis that would otherwise not be identified. The Health Secretary will in due course set out more detail of everything that I have announced today. Now, the purpose of increased testing, or one of the purposes of increased testing, is of course to help break more chains of transmission. However, that requires good support for self-isolation. The latest available survey evidence, which is UK-wide, suggests that there is good compliance with self-isolation, but we know we need to do more. I can therefore confirm today that we intend to extend eligibility for the £500 self-isolation payment to everyone on an income below the level of the real living wage. More details of this and the other steps we intend taking to support people required to self-isolate will be set out shortly by the Social Security Secretary. Presiding Officer, let me turn now to education, which I'm sure for many parents in particular watching is the information they most want to hear today. It is a statement of the obvious that all of us want to see children and young people back in full-time, face-to-face education just as soon as possible. The closure of school premises to most pupils right now is unfortunately necessary in the interest of protecting the country overall from the harm of this virus. But evidence of the wider health, developmental and social harms being experienced by children and young people concern all of us. And I have to say, and parents I know this will resonate with parents in particular, the concern is more with every single day that passes. I'm also acutely aware of the pressure school closures is putting on working parents and on family life more generally. Now, I have to be candid that our room for manoeuvre, given the current state of the pandemic, is limited. But I want to be equally candid, as I have been before, about the government's determination to use every single inch of headroom that we have to get children back to school, even if that means adults living with restrictions for longer. In short, the judgment the Cabinet arrived at this morning, and this is a judgment based on and taking full account of the advice of our expert advisers, is that if we all do agree to abide with the lockdown restrictions for a bit longer so that our progress in suppressing the virus continues, then we can begin a phased, albeit gradual, return to school from the 22nd of February, following the February midterm break. The decisions I am about to outline are intended to give young people, parents and teachers as much notice as possible, but of course I must stress that they are subject to continued progress in suppressing the virus, and they will be subject to final confirmation in 2 weeks' time. However, as of now, our intention is that from the week beginning the 22nd of February, there will be, firstly, a full-time return of early learning and childcare for all children below school age. Secondly, a full-time return to school for all pupils in primaries 1 to 3. And thirdly, a part-time return, albeit on a limited basis, for senior phase pupils to allow in-school practical work that is necessary for the completion of national qualification courses. Initially, though, it is intended that there will be no more than around 5 to 8% of a secondary school roll physically present at any one time for these purposes. We also intend to enable small increases in existing provision for children and young people with significant additional support needs where there is a clear and demonstrable necessity. Now, we will hopefully confirm these decisions in 2 weeks' time, and at that stage I also hope that we can set out the next phase of the gradual return to school, and also at that time set out even an indicative timescale for the return of in-person learning in our colleges and universities. Presiding Officer, before I leave education, let me make one additional point. I spoke about testing earlier on, and that is relevant here too. I can confirm that there will be a significant expansion of testing in educational settings to support the return to nurseries and schools in the weeks ahead. It is our intention that those who work in schools and those who work in early learning and childcare settings attached to schools will be offered at-home testing twice a week. All senior phase secondary school students will be offered this as well. This testing offer will be in place for schools as soon as possible to support their return on the basis that I have set out, and we will extend it to the wider childcare sector in the weeks that follow. We are, Presiding Officer, and I think I speak for everybody across the country when I say this, we are determined to get our children back to normal schooling and by extension back to much greater normality in their lives just as quickly as it is safe to do so. That is our overriding priority, and I think it is right that it is the overriding priority of all of us. For now, I want to again thank young people and their families, as well as teachers and school and nursery staff more generally, for the patience and understanding you are showing during these incredibly stressful times. Now, to conclude, we are making progress both in suppressing the virus and in getting people vaccinated. We need to do more on both of those fronts in the weeks to come. But the path ahead does remain difficult, and it's important to be candid about that. This virus is still circulating, not just here, but across the UK, Europe and the world. And of even greater concern right now, the virus is mutating. So we must remain vigilant and we must remain disciplined. To get the virus more under control and so that we can prioritise every bit of headroom we create to get children back to school, unfortunately, we must all stay at home, except for permitted essential purposes, for a bit longer, at least until the end of this month. And when we are able to start the process of slowly easing lockdown to give us all more normality in our day-to-day lives, we will have to accept that some mitigations, like physical distancing and face coverings, will be necessary for a while yet. And I am afraid we will also have to accept that the price of greater domestic normality is likely to be, for a period at least, not going on holiday overseas. These are not easy trade-offs, but they are essential as we continue our journey through and hopefully out of this pandemic. I am grateful to everyone for their continued sacrifice. I ask everyone to stick with it. Please stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives.
Thank you very much, First Minister. The First Minister will now take questions. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A return date for nurseries, early primary and part-time older years schooling is welcome and will allow parents across the country to plan. But it is clear that heavy restrictions will remain in place until enough COVID-19 vaccine is delivered to enough people. At the moment, all the evidence shows the Scottish Government's rollout is slow, stuttering and lagging way behind the rest of the UK. While we saw record highs elsewhere this weekend, on Sunday, Scotland saw the lowest number of JAGs administered since the start of the mass rollout over a month ago. As we said last week, the new mass vaccination centres, already open elsewhere, will help pick up the pace. But all throughout January, the First Minister has disputed any and all criticism. She's rubbished suggestions from GPs, patients and even the BMA that Scotland's rollout was sluggish and missing targets that it needed to hit. Her argument today is that we're starting to catch up on vaccinating the over 80s, but the same problem is happening in the next cohorts. Today's statement indicates that 21% of 75 to 79-year-olds have received the vaccine, which is good news for them, but is still just a quarter of the proportion vaccinated south of the border. And the problem extends to all of the over 70s. They're writing to us in huge numbers about another missed target. Last Friday, Jean Freeman said they would get invitation letters by the end of the week. They've been waiting, but it hasn't happened. So let me ask the First Minister, by what date will all over 70s now get their letter or be otherwise contacted? Will she now accept further offers of support from the armed forces? And will she now finally explain why the rollout in Scotland is so far behind?
First Minister.
Look, every single one of these questions is a fair question. I don't dispute that. And I'll address each and every one of them. Indeed, whether all of them are accurate is another matter, but they are all fair. And it's incumbent on me and the Government to make sure that we address them. I've not rubbished the concerns of anybody. In fact, we've worked with GPs and others to make sure that any issues that are being raised are appropriately addressed and any challenges that are being faced are overcome. In terms of the notion that we will be living with restrictions until all of us across the UK and further across the world have vaccinated significant numbers of people, that is right to a point. I think it is also important for all of us to be candid that given what we don't yet know about the impact of the vaccine on transmission, we may actually be living with some degree of restrictions even after we have vaccinated significant proportions of the population. That is why, because of what we do know about the impact of the vaccine, that it operates to reduce severe illness and death, that it is so important that all of us have focused first on vaccinating those who are most clinically vulnerable. In terms of the specific question about over 70s, all over 70s, every adult in the clinically extremely vulnerable group will have had a letter by the end of this week at the latest. But more importantly, we are on track to meet the target we set to have vaccinated everybody in these groups with the first dose of the vaccine by the middle of February. We have got to a higher uptake of over 80s ahead of the target we set for over 80s than I thought was possible that we would even just a week ago. Now, I'm not standing here denying that we want to accelerate the overall progress, and I'll come back to that point in a second. But nor will I apologise for having deliberately focused on maximising uptake in the most clinically vulnerable groups. So I can stand here and say that of the older residents in our care homes, it's not just the case, as is being said elsewhere, that they have all been offered vaccination. 98% of them have had the first dose of the vaccine. 88% of the staff working with them have also had the first dose of the vaccine. Now, it is important because that will help us save lives and reduce the burden of illness. Similarly, although we are, as I said in my statement, we are refining the numbers that we believe are in the over 80 cohort, we think that we are probably close to 90% now of over 80s actually having had the vaccine, and we will see the number in the over 70s group grow day by day over the course of this week. Now, let me come on to the point of overall rate of progress, because I actually do think this is legitimate. I want to see the daily rate grow and accelerate. That is why I look at today's number, and I will be looking even more closely at tomorrow's number and the numbers for the rest of this week. But the number we are reporting today of people vaccinated yesterday is 55% higher than the number last Monday, and is the highest daily number that we have recorded so far. That's our challenge now, having got the depth in these top clinical priority groups, is to get the breadth in terms of the overall acceleration of the progress in the programme, and that's what we are absolutely focused on.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
I'll come back to it.
Can I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement and welcome the expansion of community testing, which I raised with her previously. Can I also send my condolences to those families who have lost loved ones? Almost a year into this pandemic, we are all too aware of the negative impact lockdown and school closures are having on children and young people. Last Thursday, the Equality and Fair Scotland budget statement cited challenges for attainment, career progression, and we know that for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, these challenges will be felt even more acutely. Yesterday, the Institute of Fiscal Studies set out that by the time the pandemic is over, most children will have missed more than half a year of normal in-person schooling. The lifetime costs of this could be as much as £40,000. So the effect of COVID on lost learning could translate into lower incomes and higher inequality. Education Scotland are now releasing weekly reports that detail all the issues still facing pupils and teachers. First Minister, significant remedial action is still required over and above what's already been done. So can I ask her, firstly, what more will the government do to address this? And secondly, councils and parents have highlighted significant difficulties in ensuring provision for pupils with additional support needs. Consequences have been hugely detrimental to their well-being. So can I ask the First Minister what increases in provision will be offered and what criteria will be used to decide which pupils will benefit?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I don't think anybody is anything other than deeply concerned. I know I am deeply concerned about the ongoing and cumulative impact on young people of having their school life so seriously disrupted. That is why the most important objective that we have as a government is to get young people back to school. I hope, based on what we have set out today, that process will begin on the 22nd of February, which at the moment will, I don't know what other plans other governments will set out, but at the moment I think we are the first government in the UK to set out the start of that phased return, and we will want to accelerate that as quickly as we can. And that's important. That's the most important thing we can do to help young people not experience any further impact from COVID in that form. We will also, for some time, I think, be requiring to invest more and to provide more support to schools, to teachers, and indeed to parents to help children catch up in terms of the impact of lost time in school over the past year. And the Education Secretary continues to discuss with COSLA and with education interests exactly what form that will require to take over the medium to long term. In the here and now, the Deputy First Minister has already set out additional funding to give local councils the flexibility to do more, for example, around digital access to learning, or to provide greater support directly to parents, and we will continue to do that. Similarly, the Education Secretary, and I'll ask him to make more information on this available, we are looking on an ongoing basis at those with additional support needs, and that's why, as well as the phased return that I set out today, we are also trying to increase the provision within the existing arrangements for those with significant additional support needs. Of a situation that has been difficult in every respect for literally every person in the country, the impact on young people is the one that certainly grieves me most, and is the one that we will be requiring to pay attention to, I think, for longest. And let's focus on getting them back to school, but also in doing everything we can to make sure that this is not the lifelong impact that some have expressed concerns about.
Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Expanding eligibility for the self-isolation grant is welcome, but there's clearly a need for a wider support package, and the Greens will bring that debate to the Chamber tomorrow. Quarantine measures for international travel are welcome too. Could have prevented so much harm if that had been in place in the months past, but it's good that it will finally be there. Parents, pupils and teachers all want schools to get back to normal, but this cannot be at the cost of safety, and the EIS are continuing to urge caution. The Greens have called for the expansion of regular testing for school staff for months now, and the Parliament backed that position in November. So in announcing a system of twice-weekly home testing today, can the First Minister tell us if it will be fully in place by the return date on February 22nd? And given that social distancing will be needed in classrooms, because we still don't know enough about transmission of the new variants, and in any case, many pupils will continue to need to self-isolate, isn't it clear that even a phased return must also be based on blended learning, with resources in place to ensure that teachers' workload is manageable?
First Minister.
The arrangements that I've set out today for twice-weekly home testing will be in place for schools as schools return on the phased basis from the 22nd of February. In the weeks thereafter, it will be further extended across other educational settings, early years, for example. There is also an existing provision that has been in place since schools returned back last August for any member of school staff who believes they have been exposed to the virus, even if they don't have symptoms, to access PCR testing. And I would take the opportunity to remind people working in our schools that that is available. In terms of the general questions about safety of schools, if I wasn't so concerned about making sure that everything we did was consistent with that paramount requirement to keep schools and everybody in schools and everybody around schools safe, we'd be putting every young person back to school as quickly as possible, because the impact on young people of being out of school is significant. But it is because we need to do that safely that we're taking a careful, gradual and phased approach to return. The new variant absolutely makes it essential that we continue to be cautious. I'm happy to ask the Chief Medical Officer to arrange a further briefing on what we are learning about the new variant for MSPs as soon as possible. I have certainly not seen any evidence that suggests that it is disproportionately affecting young people more than other groups, but it is because it is more infectious, it is liable to infect all age groups more than previous strains of the virus were. As I've said today, Public Health Scotland is also doing some further analysis on some initial evidence that suggests there may be a statistically significant increased risk of hospitalisation, not particularly of young people, of the population generally associated with this new variant, and they're doing more work on that. So we need to continue to be cautious for all of these reasons. And my final point on Patrick Harvey's question about blended learning is that while we want young people back in school full-time, face-to-face, as much as possible, yes, we will need to have blended learning available as a contingency as we go through this next phase of the pandemic. The senior phase return that I spoke about earlier on will be on a blended learning basis. It will be limited in school face-to-face provision for essential practical work necessary for exam courses. But we need to have these contingencies to make sure that as we get young people back to school, we are doing that in a way that is consistent with overall safety.
Willie Rennie to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
I've been raising it for some weeks, in fact months now, about the routine testing, so I'm very pleased that it's going to be rolled out on a wider basis, including in schools. But it wasn't quite clear whether the First Minister is going to make sure that that routine testing is available before the pupils go back or when they go back. So I'd like clarification on that. The First Minister is very controlled today, but she has been previously irritated by comparisons with England on the rollout of the vaccine. But it is a fair benchmark to make, because we need to be ambitious to what could be done. We are way behind where England is, and we need to work harder to catch up with them. The First Minister clings on to the care homes explanation for the slow rollout, but there was no reason to hold back the rest of the programme while we did the care homes. So I think she should ditch that explanation from now on. I do want to praise the teams for vaccinating 35,000 people yesterday. At last we are moving in the right direction, but it has taken 7 weeks to get there, and we're still behind England by a margin of 200,000. That's what could be done if we were keeping pace with England. So what new steps will the First Minister put in place to close that gap?
First Minister.
I'm not clinging onto anything. I'm trying to explain rationally, and people can make their own judgments on this. That's perfectly legitimate. I'm trying to explain rationally the trade-offs in the early part of this programme between, as I described it in shorthand terms in my statement, between depth and breadth. Now, as we go further into this programme, I don't think that is the same trade-off as we are now doing, to do both. But in the early stage of the programme, and it's not just in care homes, it's in the over 80s as well, making sure that we are absolutely maximising uptake in these most clinically vulnerable groups. Now, I think the information we are publishing on a daily basis on the breakdown of vaccination is much more detailed, I think, than other parts of the UK, so I don't have comparable figures, but 98% of people in care homes actually vaccinated is a different thing from saying 100% have been offered vaccination. I don't know what the actual vaccination rate is in care homes elsewhere in the UK. And similarly on over 80s, I suspect now we are getting to an uptake on over 80s that will be at least the same as and possibly even higher than it is in other nations in the UK. We estimate, and there's still work going on to refine some of the overall numbers in the cohort here, but we estimate we are getting close to 90% of over 80s that have actually had the vaccination. Now, these are extraordinary uptake figures, and it's a great credit to people who are coming forward so enthusiastically for vaccination. Now, that matters because these are the groups that are most likely to become ill and die, and that's what we know right now that the vaccine has an impact on. We don't yet know. We hope it does, but we don't yet know that it has an impact on transmission of the virus. So that is why we have concentrated in the early part of the programme on that depth. And now, as we see today in the numbers I've reported, and obviously we have to monitor that going forward this week and into future weeks, we see that start to be replicated in the breadth of the programme. So these are legitimate questions, and there is a legitimate argument that can be made that says we should just have gone for breadth rather than the depth. I accept that, but I think my judgment is that we have approached this in the right way, but it is right that we are under serious scrutiny in terms of making sure the pace of this now is what people expect, and I don't complain about that for a single second. Every one of the questions and every ounce of the scrutiny that has been rightly applied to me, I and the Health Secretary are making sure that is applied in the system as well, so that we get this moving at the speed we need it to. And in terms of the question, what are we doing additionally? This is all in the planning and in the deployment plans that the Health Secretary has set out in terms of, as we go into the younger age groups, bringing more of the mass centres on stream, as has happened this week. These mass centres not necessarily as appropriate for the older age groups who I think prefer to be done in their GP surgeries, but now that mass approach to vaccination as we go down the age groups becomes much more important. So I would not just expect, I encourage Parliament to keep intense scrutiny on this, because it's in all of our interests that we get this programme going at the speed that we all want it to.
Thank you. I'm conscious we have about 16 other members wishing to ask questions. Annabel Ewing to be followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The extension of lockdown to at least the end of February will come as little surprise to my Cowdenbeath constituents. However, people, I believe, do want to know where we are headed so that they can have some hope. So can the First Minister therefore confirm, when lockdown is lifted in due course, that we will revert to the strategic framework tiers approach, with the consequent possibility of moving down from tier 4 to lower levels, and therefore seeing greater normality in our lives? Thank you.
First Minister.
Yes, we do hope, as we come out of the lockdown restrictions we're under right now, that we will move back to a level system where we apply restrictions in different parts of the country, depending on the prevalence of the virus in different parts of the country. We're currently conducting a review of the level system that we had applied previously to make sure that we have learned from the experience of that, but also the content and the indicators of that previous level system remain appropriate in the light of where we are now, and particularly that they remain appropriate in light of the new, faster circulating variant of the virus. So we will, over the next couple of weeks, update on that review and start to look ahead to when we might be able to come out of a national or virtually national lockdown into that more varied approach, depending on how the virus is behaving in different parts of the country. As I said in my statement, we hope to be in a position that round about the start of March, we can start to look ahead to what may be a gradual, but nevertheless a definite easing of the current restrictions that we are under. But that will depend on our progress on vaccination and on suppressing the virus right now. And it will depend on having sufficient headroom to do that beyond the headroom we need to get children back to school. So right now, any headroom we think we have, we want to use to get children back to school. Once we think we've got enough, we can move on to easing restrictions for the rest of the population. But right now, in summary, I think all of us as adults have to be prepared to live with some restrictions for longer in order to get children back to greater normality first.
Maurice Golden, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, in an answer to my written question, it was revealed 14,000 pupils didn't have access to devices for online learning. Many of those in our most deprived communities, including 1,800 in Renfrewshire, 1,700 in West Dunbartonshire and 1,300 in Dundee. Why is this the case?
First Minister.
We've already made additional money available to local authorities to help them fill those gaps. We've always recognised that there are a number of young people that weren't being reached through the existing digital provision. We made money available earlier on to get devices and connections to a number of households across the country, and the additional money is intended to help local authorities go further and continue to close those gaps. So we will continue to try to do that on an ongoing basis, while of course we're doing the even more important task of getting children back into face-to-face learning.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the First Minister clarify the focused role of GPs in delivering the vaccine rollout, and does the First Minister expect this to change over the next 3-week reporting period?
First Minister. GPs have got a very important role to play in the delivery of the vaccine, and that will continue to be the case right throughout the whole progress of the vaccine programme. In the initial stages, GPs have been focused on vaccinating the most vulnerable. In the last couple of weeks, that has been the over 80s, because we judge that for the older, frailer members of our communities, then access through GP surgeries is the best way of getting them vaccinated quickly. And as I said earlier on, we think getting close to 90% of the over 80s have already been vaccinated. As we go down into the younger age groups, we will make and are already making more use of mass vaccination centres, where people will get their appointment letter to go to. It may not be, somewhere like the Edinburgh Conference Centre or the Louisa Jordan, but it may be a local village hall or community centre to get vaccinated there, while GPs focus on those that are more vulnerable, older, and where it is considered that they are the best places for the vaccination to happen. So this right throughout is going to be a mixed approach. If GPs were asked to do the whole of this programme, they wouldn't be able to do anything else. Likewise, if we didn't have GPs as an integral part of this, then we would miss a lot of people who otherwise would be vaccinated through that way. So we will continue to try to use a sensible approach, and GPs will always be integral to it. And I want to take the opportunity to thank them for the incredible work that they are doing so far.
Ian Gray, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you. Today's report from the Poverty Alliance is only the latest, which tells us that remote learning, while necessary, has widened the attainment gap. In East Lothian, the Council has partnered with Queen Margaret's University and the STV Children's Appeal to launch a tutoring initiative to support 300 senior pupils and mitigate the effects of lockdown on learning. With lockdown continuing for most pupils, why isn't the Scottish Government and Education Scotland ensuring that this kind of support is available everywhere?
First Minister.
There is a tutoring arrangement available through the eSchool platform, and we will continue, and we'd be very interested to look at approaches local authorities are taking to see if we can do more to extend them across the country. Everybody recognises the impact that this situation is having on young people, and everybody in government. I, the Deputy First Minister, want to do everything possible to help young people minimise that impact and catch up with learning that they have lost. So the tutoring arrangements are available, but we will be open-minded about anything we can do to extend these kind of opportunities further.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, as far as the vaccine programme is concerned, do you agree that the most complex and challenging stages lie ahead as we seek to both increase the pace of the rollout and ensure second doses are timely administered to the most vulnerable? For instance, now that we have over 610,000 of first vaccine doses in people's arms, we need to ensure adequate supply is available to administer the second dose. What assurances can the First Minister provide in this regard and the future rollout programme?
First Minister.
I think every stage of this vaccination programme is going to bring its own challenges, and Bruce Crawford is right. As I have tried to reflect, we have an obligation and a challenge to make sure that we are going deep into every cohort, maximising uptake while going through the bulk of every cohort as quickly as possible. So that breadth and depth can't be trade-offs as we go through the rest of the programme. We have to achieve both, and that's what we are very focused on. In terms of the need to start the second doses, some second doses are being administered on a daily basis right now, but as we get to the 12-week point for the bulk of people who have been vaccinated so far, and we have to make sure that the modelling of our supply versus uptake is sufficient to do that, and the assurance I can give is that that is factored fully into all of the assessments and all of the assumptions that we make in our modelling of what the vaccination, what rate the vaccination will happen at over the weeks to come.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Ruth McGuire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is undoubtedly true that the attainment gap is now at serious risk of widening, especially in our most deprived communities. Can I ask the First Minister what has been done now to help pupils catch up with their lost education? And why are so many supply teachers, newly and recently qualified teachers, still contacting us to tell us they're looking for work? Why are they not out there helping those who've been hardest hit by absences? Shouldn't there be a national call for anyone who is able to help to come forth and do so?
Yes, and there should be no reason right now why supply teachers are not able to get work, because we have already made available £45 million to local authorities to employ additional staff. So I would say to local authorities, you should be making full use of any offers of supply teachers that comes your way, because the funding is there to do that, and let that message go out loudly and clearly. There's a range of things that have been done right now to support children while they are out of school, and also to try to minimise the ongoing impact on their education through the digital provision that I've spoken about, through the different resources that are available on the eSchool platform, and the range of ways that we will support local authorities to make sure they have the staffing and the resources in place to support children as they start to return to school. That is vitally important, but I come back to the central point that what matters most right now in this phase of dealing with the pandemic is that we act in a way that opens up the space to get children back to school as quickly as possible.
Ruth McGuire, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to ask the First Minister if, as the vaccination programme progresses and the country begins to move out of lockdown, if consideration will be given to prioritising the opening of sports and leisure activities. It was a cause of great consternation to many of my constituents that pubs were open before folk could go to the gym or take part in sport, which could be operated safely and positively contribute to people's physical and mental health.
First Minister.
Well, I think that is a reasonable question, and obviously all of us want to get everything back to normal as quickly as possible, but what we learned last year is that we can't do everything at once, and therefore we have to prioritise, and perhaps we didn't always make the right choices when it came to prioritising last year, which is not to say that it is not perfectly legitimate for pubs and restaurants and other parts of the economy to want to open, because it absolutely is, and I want to see them back to normal as quickly as possible. But we've got to be very clear as we continue down this difficult path, as headroom opens up, what our priorities are. Now, I've been very clear again today that the first priority for the government is getting children back to education, and I think that is something that has widespread support across the country. But I think Ruth McGrath raises a very valid point. After that, what is the order of priority? If we have limited headroom then other facilities that help with the health and well-being of the population absolutely have to be there in our thinking. It's not going to be an easy balancing act this time round any more than it was last time round, but we've got the experience of last time to know perhaps what we think we did right and perhaps what we wish we had done differently, and apply that this time, and that's what we will be seeking to do.
Thank you, Jenny Mara, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Obviously, today's announcement of children getting back to school on the 22nd of February is the most important and is very welcome news. But we do know that online learning is very patchy across the country. Some pupils have the opportunity to speak to their teacher on a daily basis. Others haven't spoken to their teacher for weeks. What is the Education Secretary and the Scottish Government doing to improve this situation and make it more sustainable for those children who don't have that contact?
First Minister.
I mean, again, that's an important question, and I think that is always going to be a challenge for us for as long as children remain out of school. There was the report, the first official overview report on remote learning that was published indicating some important improvements compared to the experience of last year. And certainly my anecdotal feedback from many people across the country is the experience of online learning is much better in this second period out of school than it was in the first. But I recognise that there will be variations from in different parts of the country, so the Education Secretary continues to work with local authorities to make sure that provision is of a uniformly high standard. It is one of the reasons the additional resources were committed to local authorities to allow them to invest in the areas they thought were important. So we will continue for as long as children are out of school to make sure that that provision is as good as it can be. But we've got to recognise candidly it is not going to ever be as good as having children in school learning face-to-face, which is why I come back to the central point that getting back to that as quickly as possible is our driving priority.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the extension of the £500 self-isolation grant to people earning less than the living wage. What level of additional resources would be required to extend this to people with average earnings or less, many of whom will have families to support and which many of us would like to see?
First Minister.
I don't have a figure to hand as to exactly how much that would cost. I'm happy to have that costed and make that information available. And we will continue to look at further expansions of eligibility as we think we've got resources to support that. We're also still looking at the overall quantum of support and the other practical ways in which people who have been asked to self-isolate can be helped to do that. And as I said, the Social Security Secretary will set out more detail of all of that shortly. But I absolutely recognise, I think we all do, that particularly for people with children, being asked to self-isolate is a really difficult thing to do, and we've got to support people as much as possible.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Christine Graham.
First Minister, at the end of the week, Sunday, the 24th of January, 7,932 new cases of COVID were identified, with 20,555 contacts traced. Can I ask what proportion of that figure her government expect to have self-isolated, and how many contacts are estimated not to have been traced? Does she believe it is important that this data is tracked to increase the numbers self-isolating to break the cycle of transmission?
First Minister.
The survey data we've got on self-isolation, and there's been some work published which is UK-wide quite recently actually, and I'm trying to see if I can find it in my papers here. I can't immediately find it. I'll make it available to the Chamber. But actually it's UCL data, and it suggests that the compliance with self-isolation is relatively high, higher than I thought it might be, but it also suggests that there are still some people who are expressing difficulty in doing so. So the focus we have is ensuring that we understand the reasons why people are finding it difficult and the groups of people that are finding it difficult, and trying to target more support to that. Extending eligibility for financial support is one really important step forward. It's not the first step we've taken. We had previously widened eligibility to include parents whose children had been asked to self-isolate. So we continue to look at how we support more people. Often it's not just financial support, so the outreach service that councils operate, which is dependent on people giving their permission to be contacted. And again, all members could help by encouraging their constituents to do that, which means that councils will telephone somebody and offer more practical support, the delivery of shopping or medicines, up to and including alternative accommodation if they need it. So we need to focus on the reasons why people are struggling and help solve these problems, and that's what we are continuing to do.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I welcome the extension of quarantine requirements to anyone who arrives directly into Scotland, no matter where they travel from, and understand why the Scottish Government cannot unilaterally extend that to people who travel here via other parts of the UK, for example, England. But given that the importation of the virus is crucial, we nearly had it eliminated in the summer last year, can I ask if the First Minister, using the current travel restrictions, will tighten checks on those crossing the border?
First Minister.
Well, we continue on an ongoing basis to talk to Police Scotland about their approach to enforcement, and they continue to take what they consider to be a sensible, proportionate approach. But I will ensure that we relay the sentiment behind Christine Graham's question to the Chief Constable and ask him to consider whether there are further steps that can be taken. I know that nobody likes the idea of travel restrictions. I hate the idea of travel restrictions as well as all these other restrictions. But if there is one lesson we need to learn, there's probably more than one lesson, but if there is one overriding lesson we need to learn from last summer, is the danger of suppressing it here, which we did so successfully, and then allowing it to come back in. So that's why it's so important this time that we have much tighter restrictions in place. It's always going to be difficult when we've got the border between Scotland and England if we are not taking the same steps in Scotland as in England. So we will continue to try to support a four nations approach to this as much as we possibly can. But where that's not possible, I think we've got a duty to do as much as we can at our own hand, and that's what we're intending to do.
Alexander Burnett, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I'm sure the First Minister will join me in urging everyone to take a vaccination once offered. Now, I appreciate this may not be a number she has immediately to hand, but does she have an indication of a number of people who have refused a vaccine so far once offered it, and what is being done to convey to the public the importance of getting vaccinated?
I don't have a number to hand, and obviously the numbers in any group, once we've got through a whole group that are not vaccinated, will not just include people who are refusing to be vaccinated. They will include people who perhaps aren't getting vaccinated because of a health condition, or particularly in care homes. I think the 2% that have not taken up the vaccination, that will include people that are very close to the end of their lives. So we need to be cautious in not assuming that those who don't get vaccinated in any group are all refuseniks, people who are sceptical about vaccine. But the general point is really important here, and I think it is incumbent on all of us to encourage people to come forward. What I would say, and the figures speak for themselves here, in the cohorts where we have almost completed, the uptake is very, very high. If you had told me a few weeks ago that we would get to 98% of older care home residents vaccinated, I don't think I would have believed it. And if you had told me we would get to 90% of over 80s, I would have been equally sceptical. So that suggests there is an enthusiasm and a willingness to come forward for vaccination, and the numbers who are refusing to do are very, very small. But we must all work hard collectively to make sure they are as small as they possibly can be.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, local authorities and teaching unions are key partners in making a success of the rollout of the routine asymptomatic testing for school staff and senior phase students, and getting schools back safely, even if initially on a phased basis. Can I ask the First Minister, what discussions have you had with councils and teaching unions on these matters, which can help offer a reassurance for those who are currently working within schools, but just importantly for those staff members who may be returning to schools shortly?
First Minister.
The Education Secretary in particular has ongoing discussions with the education unions and representatives of education staff and councils through the Education Recovery Group. I think, my apologies, I think I omitted to address a question that might have been Ian Gray that directed to me earlier on about the timing of testing starting compared to the schools going back in the 22nd of February. We are intending that the beginning of that aligns with schools going back, but the Deputy First Minister will write to members with specific detail of exactly when and how that is going to be introduced. But you're right that those who work in our schools are key partners in all of this, and it's important that we continue to work very closely with them.
Neil Findlay to be followed by John McAlpine.
It's taken a full year to provide schools with home testing, and we keep being told that the government is looking at vaccinating those who work in schools. What does looking at it mean, and will these staff have to wait a similarly long time to be vaccinated because they are in the front line?
First Minister.
In terms of vaccination, I'm not sure if he still does, but as somebody who I know has shadowed the health portfolio for a lot of time, I would have assumed Neil Findlay would have known what looking at it means. It means considering and taking account of advice from the JCVI, for example. They have given us the advice on the first groups based on the clinical priority, those, to be blunt, that are most likely in descending order to become ill and die. And as we go into the wider part of the population, as the Health Secretary said earlier on, the JCVI will consider whether they want to advise on priority, and we will then consider, and as we always have done in the past, in all likelihood, adopt that advice. It's important to stress that there will be teachers who are being vaccinated, have been vaccinated and will be being vaccinated right now as part of these priority groups, people who have or who will be beginning to, that are part of the clinical extremely vulnerable groups, for example. So that is the way in which any vaccination programme should proceed, based on clinical advice, which is based on clinical priority. And of course, we want to get to the point where the whole adult population has been vaccinated as quickly as possible.
And Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much. The First Minister will be aware that the JCVI clinically extremely vulnerable list includes everyone in receipt of carers allowance and all unpaid carers of elderly or disabled people who would suffer should that care be withdrawn if the carer tested positive or was required to isolate. Can the First Minister offer reassurance to this group that they will be vaccinated with the rest of the clinically extremely vulnerable group this month? And is she confident that the system has been able to identify them all?
First Minister.
I'll ask the Health Secretary perhaps to write just with more detail of the answer I'm about to give here, but yes, we are confident that anybody who is in the clinically extremely vulnerable group will be vaccinated in the timescales I set out earlier on. With all of these cohorts, there are definitional challenges of making sure that we are properly capturing people that need to be in them and identifying everybody who is in them. I've talked a bit today about the estimates we've made for the over 80 group. We think we've slightly overestimated. We possibly slightly underestimated those in frontline health and care staff. So if you look at the figures there, you will see we've vaccinated more of those than we said was actually in that cohort. So there will be challenges around this that we need to make sure happen. But those unpaid carers will be getting their vaccination appointment starting from the third week in February. But anybody who's within the clinically extremely vulnerable group will be vaccinated in the timescale that I set out earlier.
Thank you very much, and apologies to Graham Simpson and Alex Cole-Hamilton. I'm afraid there's no time for any more questions. We're going to move on to the next item of business. Can I just encourage members to observe social distancing, wear their masks when they leave the chamber, and to follow the one-way systems around the Parliament building. Thank you.
Can I just remind members that social distancing measures in place in the Chamber and to take care in observing them. The next item of business is a Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee debate on motion 24025 in the name of Edward Mountain on inquiry into construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland. Can I say to those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Edward Mountain to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. Convener, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to contribute to this debate in my capacity as convener of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee and to move the motion. Presiding Officer, we published our inquiry report into the construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland in December 2020, over a year after we started it. And I would like to thank the many people who gave evidence to the committee, either in person or via written submission. And I'd also like to thank the clerking team who assisted us in the report. Now, we can only note the Minister's response to the committee's unanimously agreed report, which is very dismissive of our findings. On the public procurement side, our inquiry has revealed a catastrophic failure in CMAL and Transport Scotland's management of the procurement of vessels 801 and 802. We have concluded that the current procurement processes and structures are not fit for purposes. The Scottish Government's disdainful response to the committee's critical conclusion is frankly surprising. Contrary to the Minister's assertion in his written response that the committee did not highlight in detail the poor performance by the shipyard's former management as a contributory factor to the problems of this project, we did. It is clear, that, however, that the procurement process that the Minister attempts to defend was not fit for purpose. There can be no bigger failure in the process than the inability to identify at the outset that the bidder lacked the management and financial capabilities to fulfil the contract. That is precisely why the committee has called for an independent external review of the procurement processes. The Minister clearly needs to reflect further on this recommendation and to take steps to ensure lessons are learnt and that failures are not repeated. Turning to delays and cost overruns. The cost of delivering these vessels has ballooned from an original budget of £97 million to an eye-watering £200 million, and we are still counting. The ferries will also be delivered 4 to 5 years late, with islanders and other users paying a huge cost for these delays. The committee has called on Audit Scotland to undertake a detailed audit of the financial management of this contract. The committee, as I am sure do taxpayers, welcome the Scottish Government's willingness to cooperate fully with this inquiry. Turning to commercial loans. There has been a complete amazement with the Minister's response to the issue of the £45 million of Scottish Government loans made to Ferguson Marine Shipyard. The committee highlighted a total lack of transparency surrounding the purpose, agreement and payment of these loans. It is disappointing that the Minister appears to want to ignore these findings. These loans have effectively been written off following the nationalisation of the shipyard. It is therefore essential that the Scottish Government honours its commitment to cooperate fully with Audit Scotland in investigating the process it followed. The committee made specific recommendations to improve transparency and accountability with respect to future loans, and these must be fully considered and, where appropriately, implemented. Now, turning to the relationship between CMAL and female. The inquiry heard evidence that problems with the contract were not helped with the relationship between the former management of Ferguson Marine and CMAL, which became more than toxic. The Scottish Government's response records disappointment that the inquiry report does not reflect the extensive and proactive steps taken to facilitate and negotiate a better outcome with the contractor. It is clear, whatever those steps were, they failed. As the inquiry concludes, the Scottish Government should and could have acted more quickly and decisively to address these matters. It is notable that CMAS first expressed concerns to the Government in March 2016 that the contract was running behind schedule. However, the doomed attempts at mediation were not initiated till a year later. At this point, it should be remembered that the contractor had received £74 million of the total cost of £97 million in contractual payments. Given this disaster, the committee believes there must be stronger provisions on the application and enforcement of dispute resolution mechanisms in future contracts, especially of this nature, to prevent any repetition. Turning to the engagement with local communities. One of the most concerning aspects of the delay and spiralling costs of delivery of these vessels has been the impact on island communities. The committee heard widespread dissatisfaction about the limited opportunity for local communities to input meaningfully into the ferries policy. I therefore welcome the Minister's commitment to bring forward a revised communications and stakeholders strategy. This strategy must include much better and genuinely meaningful engagement on the design and delivery of new ferries. Turning to the future decision-making structure. The committee inquiry has exposed a cluttered decision-making landscape, lacking in transparency. It is clear all decision-makers involved, including the Scottish Government, have failed to some degree to effectively discharge their responsibilities. We accept that plans are already underway to review the current legal structures and governance arrangements around the provision of ferry services. Despite the Minister's belief that the current tripartite arrangement works well, this review must reflect the root and branch overhaul that the committee called for. The Minister should be mindful of the committee's suggestion that this could go as far as to result in certain bodies being merged or perhaps even abolished. Turning to the future procurement and construction strategy. The committee has concluded that the approach to procuring and delivering new ferries has to date been short-term, piecemeal and lacking in strategic direction. On this basis, the forthcoming Islands Connectivity Plan cannot be a business-as-usual updated version of previous plans. We cannot afford to have an increasingly ageing and unreliable fleet which causes major service disruptions on a regular basis. The committee is calling for nothing but a complete and the committee is calling for nothing short of an overarching strategic long-term vision for all vessels serving Scotland's ferry network, underpinned by an appropriately funded plan to replace the entire existing ferry fleet over the next 25 years. Presiding Officer, in the short time that I've been allowed, I have focused my remarks on the key issues raised by the committee. The committee believes that the Scottish Government has a responsibility to face up to the catastrophic failures that have contributed to the myriad of problems with this contract. It is simply not good enough to dismiss the conclusions reached unanimously by this committee on a cross-party basis. One simply cannot blame the contractor for all the failings. Good leaders and good systems prevent failures. Poor ones don't. We must ensure that lessons are learned, that the costly and damaging mistakes that are evident here are never, ever repeated. We believe that reforms are needed to ensure our remote island communities remain connected, and that, Presiding Officer, is what the committee has highlighted in our report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mountain. Now call Paul Wheelhouse to open for the Scottish Government. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome too the opportunity to respond to the committee report today on behalf of the Scottish Government. And I'd like to take the opportunity, as the convener has done, to thank committee members and their clerks for the detailed work they've done and the consideration of what the report clearly acknowledges are broad-ranging, complex and important issues, and thank also the many stakeholders who fed into that, not least the communities themselves. We shouldn't forget that at the heart of these issues lie the communities that rely on the vessels in the fleet, the crews that operate them, and indeed the skilled workforce at the yard at Ferguson's. These key groups have been at the forefront of our minds throughout all of this and are why we stepped in to save jobs and the yard and to ensure the vessels will be delivered. At the outset, I also want to reiterate that, notwithstanding lessons learned, we remain fully supportive of the efforts of CalMac, CMAL and Transport Scotland in delivering ferry services on the Clyde and Hebrides network, and indeed the work undertaken by CMAL to support services to the Northern Isles. However, as set out in my written response to the committee, we also recognise the challenges in doing their work and the need for continuous improvement, for investment and to optimise delivery of infrastructure to support our lifeline services. Along with my colleagues, particularly the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, I've taken time to reflect upon the content of the report. And as set out in my written response, there are some conclusions in the report with which we do not agree, and some instances where we believe the conclusion or recommendation doesn't necessarily fully reflect the breadth of evidence presented to the inquiry. However, and I stress this for the convener's benefit and other members of the committee, we do recognise that the committee focuses in relation to the two ferries and the delay in their delivery. The outcome has been particularly impactful on communities awaiting the delivery of ferries that have been yet to be completed, and clearly the cost outturn and delays are far from what was anticipated or desired at the point of contract award to FML. We accept that lessons have to be learned, and I want to reassure members that they are being learned. However, I would again reiterate our view that contractor failure played the primary role in these difficulties, and we are disappointed. I appreciate the convener's points, but this was not more fully reflected in the final report. Although I accept, as is the committee's right, the committee has the right to take its own view on these issues, but the government is also entitled to take a view as well. I would, though, also take this opportunity to refute comments made by some following publication of a reply to the committee, and it's clear from the commitments I'm about to reiterate that we have indeed reflected on the feedback and are already implementing improvements that colleagues may welcome. Presiding Officer, we've already committed to commission a study on the legal structures and governance arrangements which exist between the tripartite group of Transport Scotland, CMAL and CFL. This relationship was considered at length throughout the inquiry, and I can assure the Chamber that the organisations involved have committed to engage constructively in that review process and to reflect on the recommendations produced. However, we also recognise and want to safeguard areas in which the tripartite arrangements are judged to perform well now. Preparation for this project is well advanced, and we are currently evaluating submissions from advisers with a view to commencing this work shortly. And I'll update the committee on the initiation of the work, and ministers will also update the committee or its successor committee accordingly on progress and outcomes on that important work later in the year. We're absolutely committed to the principle that those directly affected by decisions around ferry services are able to engage in the decision-making process in a meaningful way, and I certainly note the convener's remarks around this being an important area of the committee's report. As was evident during the inquiry itself, there are often competing views from different groups, and it's important to balance these within our decision-making, and this will include consideration around value for money, around the lifetime costs of any investment as well. We have already begun the process of developing a revised communications and stakeholder strategy, and I welcome the positive feedback on Transport Scotland and CMAL's most recent engagement on the new Isla vessel provided to the committee by the CalMac Community Board. And we will continue to build on these improvements with stakeholders to develop greater transparency in how community views are received and included in our decision-making. In particular, we'll provide a clear explanation of why specific design decisions have been reached and why in instances where the community or individual preferences have not been reflected in the final outcome. Indeed, as an example of ongoing engagement, CMAL, CalMac and the Transport Scotland held a webinar on the 14th of January to outline the analysis around the new Isla vessel options and how stakeholder views had helped shape the consideration and investigations currently underway, and there were 140 individuals who attended that webinar. We'll also publish a ferry stakeholder engagement strategy later in the year to improve engagement with communities. On due diligence, whilst audits have demonstrated compliance with public procurement procedures, we are committed to enhancements of arrangements where possible. And to that end, CMAL are committed to an enhanced due diligence process for all contracts of value greater than £500,000. CMAL also intend to engage the services of a shipbroker to enhance analysis around shipyards, including established track record, their skills and competencies, and first-class products. An additional level of assurance for tender assessment will be introduced by engaging naval architecture companies to support the process. I also note the committee's request to provide updates regarding costs and programme. We are committed to being transparent and reporting the progress on hulls 801 and 802, and I note that Tim Hare from Ferguson Marine Port Glasgow provided an update to the REC Committee on 19th of January regarding COVID-19's impact on production at the yard. It's my understanding that a further case of COVID was detected, with the individual being sent home from work and has been self-isolating, along with 11 suspected close contacts, in line with the test and trace procedures. And may I take a moment to wish a speedy recovery to those individuals involved. I note the convener and the committee's concerns regarding the purpose of the commercial loans provided to FML by the Scottish Government and sharing of information about them with CMAL, which was referenced by the convener. And the purpose of those two loans is recorded in the contract documentation published on the Scottish Government website for September 2017 and June 2018 loan agreements, alongside the conditions and monitoring associated with the loans. We took great care to ensure proper separation between the two contractual spheres and could not share confidential commercial information with any of FML's clients, including CMAL, without breaching its duty of confidentiality to FML at the time. However, Scottish ministers did have a full understanding of the complex commercial and contractual issues at play when taking decisions. Presiding Officer, we remain committed to the actions I've outlined to Scotland's lifeline ferry services and to the communities they serve. The Government's actions have also saved hundreds of jobs in Inverclyde and within the local supply chain, and I hope that is at least something we can all agree is a positive outcome. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And now calling Graham Simpson to over the Conservatives. Mr Simpson, please.
Thank you very much. Can I start by thanking the committee for its work on this inquiry and for managing to unanimously agree a report and a set of challenging and robust recommendations. Now, I was looking through my dictionary for the definition of humility. It is to show that you are conscious of your failings. And normally, when a government is lambasted in the way this government has been in the committee report on the construction of ferries, the Minister would have done just that. He or she would have taken the criticism on the chin, thanked the committee for its diligent work, promised to take the action they called for, and vowed never to let anything similar happen again. When I found the word humility in the dictionary, I also found two other words nearby: humble pie. And that is what the Minister should have been eating. Instead, what we have had is my final word from my lexicon labours: humbug. The Minister's response was nothing short of a disgrace, appalling, in denial, shameful, arrogant even. It was unbelievable from start to finish. In essence, the Minister, or whoever it was from Transport Scotland who wrote his response, was saying to the committee, "We gave you the evidence, but you didn't listen to us, so you are wrong." At the heart of this is the complete failure to deliver two ferries on time and on budget. They are neither.
Briefly, Minister.
I'm grateful to the member. I'll keep this brief, Presiding Officer. Would the member acknowledge, in the speech I have just given at the outset of this debate, we have acknowledged significant areas where the report made recommendations we have adopted? Are we not, though, also entitled to say where we believe the balance of the evidence said something different? We certainly accept the committee's report and we will support it, but we are identifying that there are some
not brief enough, Minister.
We disagree with.
Mr Simpson.
I don't think he has accepted anything in the report from what he said. The ferries will be up. You see, he's saying I'm not listening. It's just like he's told the committee. You didn't listen. The ferries will be up to 5 years late if they're ever finished, and the cost has more than doubled. If ferry owners CMAL, a government body, was privately run, it would be out of business by now. The upshot is that the taxpayer is out of pocket, nothing new with this government, and the communities that the ferries are meant to serve have to put up with old vessels, much like the rest of our island communities. The committee said it believes there's been a catastrophic failure in the management of the procurement of vessels 801 and 802, leading it to conclude that these processes and structures are no longer fit for purpose. And anyone taking a rational analysis of what's happened would conclude the same. But the Minister, in his breathtaking response, says, "We do not accept the committee's description of a catastrophic failure." It's not his fault. It's not the fault of Transport Scotland. It's not the fault of CMAL, both arms of the government. The government and its bodies are, in his view, entirely blameless for what has gone wrong. There's nothing to see here now, so move along, please, everyone. Well, if Minister Paul Wheelhouse really believes that, then he should change his name to Paul Asleep at the Wheelhouse.
Can I just say to members, sit down just a minute, I have no spare time in hand, right? So just make that plain to members now. Minister, you can deal with this, you're summing up. So just to let you know, I'll give you a little bit extra, but I can't do it after this, I'm sorry.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful. Nobody but the Minister and his chums in Transport Scotland and CMAL agree with his response. He should have been taking the committee's report and using it to knock heads together at both these organisations, but he hasn't. He frankly looks afraid to rock the boat with CMAL or Transport Scotland, the former of which, instead of showing some corporate humility, is actually expanding its empire. It's extraordinary. The committee said that a root and branch overhaul of current decision-making structures is urgently needed, and that this should consider the relative roles and responsibilities of all bodies involved in decision-making around the procurement of new vessels. And it should streamline the decision-making structures by merging or abolishing certain of them. They mean CMAL. What they are saying, and I agree with them, is we do not need CMAL. They also say that the next Clyde and Hebrides network franchise should be for a much longer period of time than is currently the case. That would give the operator the chance to take responsibility for the ferries, to procure their own and get on with modernising an ageing fleet that is not fit for purpose. That's a model which is followed successfully elsewhere in the world, such as in British Columbia in Canada. One of the most concerning aspects of this debacle, for me, has been the loss of tens of millions of pounds in loans from the taxpayer. There's a pattern emerging here where the SNP government ploughs money into private firms, which is then lost forever. We've also seen it with BIFAB recently, but there's never a hint at contrition. It's almost as if it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the taxpayer has lost out through this fiasco, but perhaps more importantly, so do the disgruntled island communities who deserve better. And that's why we need Audit Scotland to urgently investigate. The way forward is not to bury your head in the sand, but to listen to the MSPs of all parties on that committee who've said unanimously that wholesale change is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Sims. I call on Colin Smith to open for Labour. Mr Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's much that can be said about this ferries fiasco, but it can be summed up in 3 words in the Rural Economy Committee's report: a catastrophic failure. 2 ferries, 100 million over budget, double the planned cost and rising, and 4 years at least late, depriving our island communities of these lifeline ferries. Yet astonishingly, and I have to say arrogantly, the Scottish Government's response in the Minister's dismal letter to the committee is to say, and I quote, "The outcome has not been that for which we had hoped." The very definition of an understatement. It was a shocking response from a government that is in denial, out of touch and thinks it's beyond criticism. No humility at all, and no apology again from the Minister today. Presiding Officer, it's just not good enough. Not good enough for Scotland's taxpayers, for ferry passengers, for the workforce at Ferguson's. They all deserve a lot better. Week after week during this inquiry, the committee received damning evidence exposing weaknesses at every part of the process and mistakes from every organisation involved. The clear conclusion: the procurement processes and structures are, and I quote from the cross-party report, no longer fit for purpose. A conclusion few could credibly argue with. It's why the committee was unanimous in calling for a root and branch overhaul of current decision-making structures. The committee hoped the report would act as a stimulus to improve how things are done, to ensure we never again find ourselves in this position, to create a ferry procurement system that is fit for purpose. Instead, the response from the government is, and I'm sorry to say this, tinkering at the edges of a process whose failings were not just graphically exposed by this fiasco, but in fact were already flawed. A process that is too disconnected from the communities our ferries are supposed to serve, too slow to replace our ageing vessels, and too short-sighted to provide certainty to the shipbuilding industry in Scotland. There has clearly been a case for a fundamental overhaul to the processes for some time, and this fiasco has just made that an urgent necessity. The committee's aim throughout was not to point fingers or lay blame needlessly, but to identify what went wrong, to learn lessons for the future. But the Minister's response makes me fear for the future. To be fair, I do sympathise with Paul Wheelhouse. He's been left to clean up the mess made by the inaction of previous ministers to meaningfully intervene when the government knew these contracts were going so badly wrong. And the failure, I have to say, of the First Minister and Derek Mackay to give evidence to the committee leaves us unable to answer questions over why ministers made the particular decisions they did and failed to take more robust action to intervene at an earlier stage. But, Presiding Officer, the refusal of the government to acknowledge the significant structural failures of the process does beg the question, what did go wrong according to the government? Their answer appears to be that it's all down to failures on the part of Ferguson's Marine. The Minister said in his letter, contractor failure has been a very significant factor in the difficulties we have seen, highlighting, and again I quote, the contractor's non-performance, contract management and financial management described in independent evidence to the inquiry. The committee certainly highlight questions over these issues, including the management and financial capabilities at Ferguson. And we heard from the workforce whose own concerns were clearly ignored by Ferguson's management at the time. There is clearly a need, however, for Audit Scotland to undertake a more forensic inquiry into the financial management of the contract by CML. And I have to say the role of ministers in the process, including the awarding of contract loans to Ferguson's. But I do find it astonishing that the Scottish Government think blaming contractor failure alone is a good defence of the procurement processes which gave them the contract in the first place. If this entire fiasco is almost exclusively, and that's what the Minister said, almost exclusively as a result of the mismanagement, incompetence and the lack of capability on the part of Ferguson's Marine, then how were they awarded the contract in the first place? It exposes the fact that in awarding this contract, there was a clear lack of robust due diligence on the part of CML in assessing the financial stability of Ferguson's and its capabilities in areas such as project management and design. And it raises serious questions over the Scottish Government's willingness, indeed political desire, to proceed despite what we now know were significant risks. That deserves further investigation, and if necessary, I have to say, criminal investigation as to the awarding of this contract in the first place. This does not undermine Ferguson's at all. Indeed, quite the contrary. This yard was more than capable of delivering ships, but we know now it was not capable of delivering this contract. It's clear to me that CML failed in its duties when it came to due diligence, and the time has come to consider whether an organisation for which there does appear to be no legal requirement should actually exist at all, and in fact should be scrapped. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the one group of people who were not to blame for this fiasco is the Ferguson's workforce, and I want to highlight the committee's recommendation paying tribute to the skills and dedication of those workers. That workforce have been a credit to the yard in the most challenging of circumstances. I'll say more in my closing comments about the future processes, but we should pay tribute to the workers and the importance of maintaining those skills and that yard when it comes to future procurement of ferries.
Sorry, you must conclude. Sorry. John Finney, please. Open for the Greens, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Colleagues on the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee will know that I wasn't an enthusiast about this inquiry. I wondered what we could achieve other than a cursory examination of what are very detailed issues. I have to say the committee gave it its best shot, but I still believe that it wasn't going to bring one single ferry one day earlier to the constituents that I'm obliged to serve, and it actually was a distraction, not least from the catastrophic Brexit. The lead role in this lies with the Scottish Government. They have overall responsibility and they should have taken charge, and it's entirely reasonable for the health to think. The Minister's letter has been alluded to. I won't labour the point. I think there's been points made about it. But to say Scottish ministers remain fully supportive of our transport agency, Transport Scotland, of Caledonian Marine Assets Limited, that's simply disappointing. Now, the Minister rightly points out that these structures were in place before 2007,
but then goes on to reflect on whether the governance arrangements between the tripartite bodies remain fit for purpose, having regard to the overarching objectives of effective, efficient and economic delivery of lifeline services. Really? Ministers don't know the answer to that already. I want to turn to CMAL, and most folks would go, who? And who indeed? I think we get a flavour of CMAL from a series of tweets they put out at the end of December, Presiding Officer. And I bear no ill will to any of the people that whose posts I refer to. They announced that they were appointing a new financial director who would be responsible for CMAL's financial strategy to provide efficient, cost-effective and safe ferries, harbours and infrastructures. Well, that would have been very good to have had that. Cost-effective is not building vessels that don't fit harbours. It is listening to your customers. And we saw the shambles with Isla Lewis and Ullapool. And notwithstanding the webinar, I fear we may be about to repeat it again with Isla. A head of support they want, overseeing the successful implementation of strategies, plans and policies. That was clearly absent with 801 and 802. Now, the tweet that I did find interesting was that they were leaving the Port Glasgow headquarters temporarily to make way for an office expansion project. I'd make that move permanent. I'd a different sort of removal altogether. CMAL need removed from the equation the so-called cluttered landscape where no one takes responsibility for anything. A protective shield for the ineffective Transport Scotland, both frequently missing in action in this, and a further buffers to minister. Now I'm going to turn to Ferguson Marine, and I would echo the comments of Colin Smith here. Outstanding skilled workforce. But as regards the management, Mr McCall, initially not playing ball with us, jetted in from his tax haven with his film crews in tow, dumps a large dossier on the table, pontificates and jets out again. It suggested to me not a penny of his personal money went into this project. He wanted the profile, he had his chance, he failed. He has limited scope for criticism of others. He lacks credibility on this issue other than as a failed shipbuilder. Self-evidently things went wrong, but there is an opportunity. We're a maritime nation. We need a fleet of new vessels. We have a workforce with proven skills, with a yard. The yard was saved. And the Scottish Government should embrace the word nationalisation. There's up to their credit that they saved this yard in the community. But they do need to get a grip. And finally, I'd like to say about the operator, CalMac. The innocent party in all this, a 6-year contract is inadequate. It should be much longer. The Seaport contract is 15 years. I would award it directly, and this would assess with forward planning, with fleet, show the fleet and infrastructure aligned. There's much to be learned here about an integrated transport system. There is a role for Audit Scotland. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call Mike Rumbles to open for Liberal Democrats. Mr Rumbles.
Presiding Officer, I want to re-emphasise to colleagues that the committee report was a unanimous one. We've heard that already. All committee members constructively engaged with each other and with our witnesses throughout the process. What was the aim of our report? It was simply to influence the Scottish Government on how best to improve the system of ferry procurement. And to do that, we had to examine in detail what had led up to the situation where the current system had failed simply to produce the goods. By and large, committee members successfully resisted a partisan approach to this. I was particularly concerned that committee members did not divide on this report, because it had been my experience since our Scottish Parliament was established back in 1999 that we were far more likely to get the Scottish Government to act on our conclusions and recommendations if we worked constructively together to reach a unanimous report. And I thank my colleagues for working to do just that. We've done it. But that is why I'm afraid I'm so astonished and disappointed with the Scottish Government's written response to our report. Presiding Officer, to solve a problem, you first have to accept that a problem exists. If that isn't done, then no matter how many constructive recommendations are made, they will be ignored. That is what the Scottish Government has so far done with our report. I quote from our report the words catastrophic failure. I quote, the committee believes there has been a catastrophic failure in management of the procurement of vessels 801 and 802, leading it to conclude that these processes and structures are no longer fit for purpose. The committee believes that the experience of the ferries contract has exposed a cluttered decision-making landscape that lacks transparency and where there has been varying degrees of failure by all of those with decision-making responsibilities, including the Scottish Government. What is the Scottish Government's written response to our unanimous report? And I quote, Scottish ministers remain fully supportive of our transport agency, Transport Scotland, of Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, CMAL, and of Calmac Ferries Limited, CFL. So much for our unanimous view that the system is not fit for purpose. The Minister says, and again I quote, I trust that the evidence provided by Scottish ministers has assisted the committee with its understanding of what is a well-established process with the parties' roles and responsibilities clearly set out. And again from the Minister, I am satisfied that procurement in relation to 801 and 802 were undertaken fastidiously, in good faith and following due diligence. Contrast that with one of our witnesses on being asked why a bid that was the highest quality, but also the highest price was successful. He responded, and I quote him, I do not know the answer, but three things bring to mind. One is incompetence, another is vested interest, and the final one is corruption, unquote. Personally, I feel the answer to that question is simply incompetence, more than anything else. But for the Scottish Government to turn a blind eye to the evidence from so many witnesses that there were real problems and many deficiencies in the whole procurement management system is quite mind-boggling. What I actually expected from the Scottish Government in its response to our report was an acceptance that things had gone badly wrong with everyone making mistakes along the way. What did we get? The Minister actually criticising the committee. I would, however, respectfully record some disappointment, basically criticising the committee for not blaming the management at Ferguson's even more. Presiding Officer, I said earlier that to solve a problem, you first have to acknowledge that there is a problem to solve. The Scottish Government is simply blaming the contractor, does not see its own failings and that of its agencies. I am sure now that our report will end up simply gathering dust on the Scottish Government self, and there are none so blind as those who will not see.
Thank you, Mr Rumbles. Thank you.
Of everybody's time, taxpayers' money. Minister, you really should have done so much better.
Thank you. I'm sorry, time's very tight. Open debate. I call Stuart Stevens, followed by Peter Chapman. 4-minute speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We would not be here today if the project manager and their office conducted their activities in relation to construction of 801 and 802 at Ferguson's Marine with anything approaching normal professional standards. It was not a mere contributory factor. Now, I make that observation as someone who's run projects of a similar financial scale and collections of projects, multiples of the scale of this project. The contract and processes around procurement were industry standard and had worked previously, and they're not just used in Scotland, but widely. The response of those in charge of procurement to the manager's failure, however, was inadequate and substantially contributed to why we are where we are today. Question, did CMAL know about the project manager's failures early enough to have intervened to minimise the damage? And my conclusion is almost certainly. Did the complexity of the procurement structure, which involved CMAL, Transport Scotland and the government, contribute to the problem? Yes, I'm pretty clear. It was more complicated than it needed to be. But the legal requirement to have that structure only ceased at 2,300 hours on the 31st of December 2020. I've never said leaving the EU didn't have some advantages, and this might be just one of them. So I see Graham Simpson nodding to that one. Question. In providing financial assistance to Ferguson Marine, should the enterprise agency have informed CMAL and others of doing so? And my answer, and here I differ from the quite strongly held views, I don't misrepresent them, I hope, of Edward Mountain, is that no, they should not have told them. Now, it's by not being told by the funder through proper oversight of the project, the CMAL should have known by other means. Now, why? In providing support to a commercial company, the enterprise agencies must not discriminate in favour of state companies over private sector ones, although I heard Graham Simpson say we shouldn't be ploughing vast sums of money in a private company. It's unusual from those benches, but there we are. The whole point is that we have to be blind as to whether it's a state company or a private sector company. There's nothing new about this. This is what's termed Chinese walls. Now, I'll just tell you a little story from my own experience. In the 1980s, my spouse was part of a team of advisors to the Distillers Company when they were bidding to purchase Bell's whisky. For my part, one of my teams working for me was a part of the Bell's team on the other side of that takeover battle. There was clearly a conflict of interest in our household between our respective professional interests. The old saw is, he who would a secret keep must first keep secret that they have a secret to keep. My spouse and I discussed nothing about this and knew nothing of each other's involvement in this until 6 months after the event, having lunch with someone who raised the subject who'd been involved in it. That was the first time we knew we had been on opposite sides of a takeover battle on the stock exchange. That is how it has to work with the kind of Chinese wall. And so enterprise companies must do so in this context. But of course, the examination of the accounts receivable, the knowledge of where the business was getting its contracts for, would have been an important part for CMAL. Concluding, Presiding Officer, the primary failure definitely lay with the yard, but I do think CMAL could have done more, and I do hope, Minister, that we will look at that very carefully. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Peter Chapman to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Presiding Officer, the REC Committee's report into the building of ferries 801 and 802 was damning, and we decided that it was indeed a catastrophic failure. This was our view after a very comprehensive and detailed study of the facts, and indeed led to our unanimous conclusion. So Paul Wheelhouse's subsequent dismissal of much of our report was therefore truly shocking. Paul Wheelhouse has demonstrated an unbelievable degree of arrogance and a worrying degree of ignorance. His response amply shows what we already know about this SNP administration, namely that it shows a shocking level of incompetence, little understanding of business, and a cavalier attitude to wasting millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Normally, individuals and governments learn from mistakes, but with attitudes like this, it is no surprise that industry has no confidence in this SNP government and that their economic growth rate continues to lag behind that of the rest of the UK. These ships will eventually be delivered, but will be 5 years late and at least 2.5 times over budget. And I know it from last week's budget statement that Ferguson Marine is to receive another 47 million in taxpayers' money this year. And yet, incredibly, Paul Wheelhouse says, and I quote, "I am satisfied that procurements for 801 and 802 were undertaken fastidiously, in good faith, and following appropriate due diligence." Really? Well, Minister, that is not what the committee found. Our experience was that Transport Scotland and CMAL applied inadequate due diligence in scrutinising and signing off the procurement process. There was a lack of scrutiny of the financial stability of the winning bidder, and the Scottish Government was willing to proceed despite significant risks associated with awarding the contract to Ferguson Marine. There has been a catalogue of errors and failings by ministers and CMAL, but I was particularly concerned to learn that 4 years after the contract was awarded, 95% of the sign-offs on the basic design of the vessels were still not completed. It is of grave concern that CMAL did not intervene to halt this process as soon as it became aware that Ferguson Marine was proceeding to build at risk without having secured a sign-off of the basic design. Presiding Officer, these are the wrong ships given to the wrong yard, and the outcome is island communities across the West Coast suffering a poor and unreliable service. Their promised new ships are nowhere to be seen, and the whole Calmac service is stretched to breaking point. There is no spare ferry anywhere in the system, and if there is a breakdown or a ship needs maintenance, sailings must be cut and islanders' essential journeys abandoned. This makes running a business on our islands already expensive and difficult, almost impossible. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, this is a debacle of the worst kind. It has cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of pounds, has made life for our island communities more difficult, and far from securing a reliable future for the Ferguson Marine Yard. I believe they will find it difficult to secure new work under the dead hand of this incompetent government and with the abysmal legacy of these ferries. The failure of this yard could well be the final disaster of this whole story saga. A sad end for a committed, skilled and reliable workforce who deserve so much better. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, first of all, I just want to touch upon a couple of comments that I've heard from colleagues. Peter Chapman there actually complained about the £47 million going into the budget for next year for that yard. And he also quoted saying that the order was given to the wrong yard. His final comments actually were really quite astounding. I mean, if the order was given to the wrong yard, the yard would have shut. The yard wouldn't have been there. We wouldn't have over 400 people employed at that yard. So his comments are actually quite ridiculous. Then we've got the Greens. Remove CML from Port Glasgow. Take jobs away from Port Glasgow. Take more jobs away from Inverclyde. Then the Labour Party has Colin Smith's comments calling for a criminal investigation into the awarding of the contract. So Labour don't actually want the order, don't want the work at Ferguson's and Port Glasgow. I'm looking forward to putting that in my election leaf for May. And also in terms of Graham Simpson's comments earlier on, scrapped CMAL. And so that's jobs to be lost. And then he also complained about the loans, the £50 million and the £30 million loan. That finance, as well as other things, actually helped secure this yard and kept the yard. I've only got 4 minutes, Mr Simpson. I normally do take interventions, but not today. Saying also, I note the report and the recommendations of the report, but I do respectfully disagree with parts of it. I do agree with some parts, but respectfully disagree with others. Not one person can state that what's happened at the yard over many years has been positive. Not one person. And as a constituency MSP for Grinton and Inverclyde, as someone who grew up in Port Glasgow, and also the son of a coppersmith whose last job was working at the yard, my loyalty has always been towards the yard. I want the yard, I'm sorry, I can't take any. I want the yard to succeed. I want the yard to build more ships, and I want the yard to employ more people and have a future for many decades to come. Now, I've never been particularly vexed about the ownership or the management of the yard. I'm not really fussed as to whether it's a nationalised yard or whether it's a privatised yard. It's about the success of the yard. It's about the jobs. It's about the future. It's about apprenticeships. And certainly, as we currently stand, it's about the completion of these ships to ensure that we can build more ships in the future. Now, the report is full of many aspects, but what is clear to the independent reader is that the Scottish Government has consistently supported the yard and its workforce. And I'm glad that the committee itself have inadvertently recognised that by the final bullet point in section 71 on page 29. And my constituency, my community welcome the fact that the Scottish Government have proceeded and saved the yard. From the awarding of the contract, which was won fairly, to the two loans of the £50 million and the £30 million, to the rescue of the yard, it's clear that this SNP government has more than stepped up to the plate to support shipbuilding on the Lower Clyde in my constituency. And I believe that the workforce, they know that, they know the local community knows that, and every single politician knows that, even though they will not say it publicly. Presiding Officer, the report goes on to touch upon a number of things, including the future approach to standardising the vessels. And I agree with that. Robbie Drummond mentioned that certainly in his contribution. It's also in section 120. Section 129, and the evidence from CMAL about FML, changing strategy after winning the contract, may go some way to helping explain section 96 and the damaging evidence from Tim Hare, the Tunnel Director, when he said, and I quote, 5% of them, that's the sign-offs of the basic design, were completed and 95% were not completed when we took control of the yard in August 2019. Presiding Officer, one thing is for certain, I want in the future I want as much work as possible to go to Port Glasgow, and not the hulls to be built in Vietnam or lower-cost countries then brought to Port Glasgow as described in the evidence on the 29th of January by Dr Ralph Baird, or also the scrapping of the 2 vessels as advocated in the same evidence session by Roy Pedersen. That would have resulted in mass job losses and also the possible closure of that yard. Now, my constituency, my community knows it's this SNP government that saved that yard, saved the jobs, and they now have a future. Thank you very much.
Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We're debating the abject failure of the Scottish Government's building of those new ferries. Meanwhile, the communities there struggle due to being badly served by old vessels subject to breakdown. We need a fundamental review of how we provide lifeline services to these islands and how we procure new ferries. We no longer need to tender these services. While we're in the EU, there were regulations, but even then there were exemptions to those regulations, such as the Topical Agreement. However, now that we've left, there is no argument for this complex web of companies having a hand in owning and running our ferries. We need to abolish CMAL. There is a strong argument to say that CMAL should CalMac should own, buy and procure ferries it runs. The last few vessel procurement processes have been proven to be vanity projects looking for kudos for CMAL rather than fit-for-purpose ferries our island communities desperately need. Ferries themselves have been eye-wateringly expensive, and so have the alterations to harbours and that were needed to be able to allow them to berth. One would have hoped the boats were built to fit the harbours, not the other way around. Not one bit of this has provided a better service for islanders. We are now looking at a cost close to 200 million for 2 ferries that could have been procured at a fraction of that price. I'm told that a reasonable price to pay would be around 10 million. Add to that the cost of ensuring fair work practices for the workforce building them, and you would still almost have enough money to renew the whole fleet from what has been spent. Meanwhile, our communities suffer due to old ferries breaking down and having to make do with replacement boats that are not fit for purpose. Those vanity projects do not take into account the ferries have to move around the different routes, as we've heard in the debate, when maintenance is needed or indeed when breakdown occurs. Because these ferries need bespoke harbours, they will not be able to provide cover for other routes. What is also required is additional capacity. A relief vessel for winter maintenance periods would also add capacity in the summer when people struggle to get onto a boat. While one is procured, the Scottish Government need to look to lease a relief vessel, and Pentland Ferries have a spare boat. Why cannot an agreement be reached to lease that from time to time when the need arises? The sheer folly of allowing building to start on these ferries before this design was signed off is breathtaking. The fuel used is supposed to make them more environmentally friendly, but I understand that any benefit that might be gained would only be on journeys a lot longer than they will be taking. Therefore, they will not be more environmentally friendly, especially when the fuel is being shipped from the other side of the world. This also adds to their complexity, no doubt, and will no doubt leave them more subject to breakdown. You really couldn't make it up. The government's response to the committee clearly shows that no lessons have been learned. Presiding Officer, there has been no apology, not for squandering the taxpayers' money, not for their incompetence, and sadly, not to the workers and the island communities that they have so badly let down.
Thank you very much. I call Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And although uncomfortable reading, I welcome the conclusions and recommendations of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee's report into the construction and procurement of ferry vessels, and thank the committee for its sterling work over many moons. I speak as constituency MSP for Cunningham North, which includes Arran, the community directly impacted by the lengthy delay in delivering into service Ferry 801, or the Glen Sannox as it is now named. Along with obvious project management failures by Ferguson Marine, others with decision-making responsibilities, Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited in particular and Transport Scotland, are accused of failing to discharge them competently and effectively. There was a lack of clarity regarding remit and no clear processes to escalate matters quickly when these went unfulfilled, resulting in mounting costs, delays and little progress. The vessels were originally due to be completed in 2018 are now 5 years overdue, and COVID restrictions could delay this further. But let's go back to the beginning. Why was the Glen Sannox needed? Because many positive developments introduced by this government, such as the introduction of road equivalent tariff, which I relentlessly and successfully lobbied for over many years, huge increases in the number of summer sailings, addition of the MV Katrina on the Lacranza route, etc., all increased service demand. Together with the beauty of Arn as a destination and a rapidly ageing fleet, increasing adverse weather conditions with diminishing vessel resilience, all made at least one new ship essential. In scores of Arn ferry committees I participated in, islanders argued for a couple of Finlagan-style vessels more able to utilise their dross and deliver a better all-year weather service. However, Transport Scotland and CMAL were intent on reinventing the wheel with a new world-beating design using liquid natural gas. Of course, when the contract was awarded, all seemed well, and I recall with no opposition, which has obviously been sharpened by hindsight. The price differential in accepting a foreign tender was not enough to outweigh the benefits of construction at a yard an 8-minute drive from CMAL HQ, where an historic shipyard could also be revitalised, creating and sustaining hundreds of skilled jobs in an economic black spot. However, as progress faltered and stopped entirely, island communities had to endure the very real impact these delays imposed on island economies and populations. I was struck by the evidence heard of stakeholder engagement, which emphasised the need for decision makers to engage in a far more meaningful way with island communities about ferry procurement and construction. If communities don't feel their views have a material impact on the design and delivery of new vessels, dissatisfaction is likely to continue into how they regard day-to-day ferry services. I therefore welcome government commitments to improve community engagement, which must be meaningful with tangible outcomes to give the communities evidence they are being listened to and their views genuinely considered, which is vital to rebuilding the trust of islanders. Even when design choices are not clearly influenced by consultation, increased transparency should lead to a greater understanding of the considerations involved. Clearly, we need a comprehensive overhaul of the key decision-making processes around ferry vessel procurement. Islanders cannot understand how the current state of affairs was allowed to drag on, even after alarm bells began to ring back in 2017. An independent review based on the committee's findings and recommendations is needed urgently. And for too long, decision-making on new ferry construction and procurement has been delayed despite the repeated concerns of CalMac, RMT, islanders and other ferry users, as well as MSPs of all political persuasions, including me. Many ferries are significantly beyond their original planned operational lifespan, and more vessels must be ordered. With Transport Scotland already knows the views of island communities, this should happen now. Presiding Officer, we must absorb and learn from this report and take on board its findings to ensure this does not happen again. The commitments by the Scottish Government so far are hugely encouraging, but they must be fulfilled, and ordering new vessels while ensuring a start date on site for the associated but seemingly never-ending Ardrossan Harbour redevelopment is essential to dock and service the Glen Sannox would be a very good start.
Thank you very much. I call Finlay Carson to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Those of a certain age will remember a TV show called Blankety Blank, attracting millions of viewers every week. Well, it would appear that the Scottish Government is attempting to resurrect that show, but their version is certainly no laughing matter. Their version should be called Blank Cheque, with this scatter cash SNP government apparently happy to dish out money as if it was simply going out of fashion. How else can you explain its catastrophic failure in this disastrous procurement of 2 new ferries for Ferguson Marine destined for CalMac? The undoubtedly skilled workforce in Port Glasgow Yard were due to deliver these ferries to serve in the Clyde and Hebrides network 3 years ago. Today, they're still tied up and will now not be completed until next year. And if we're lucky, the second might be in 5 years. More importantly, because of the incompetence of the Scottish Government, they are going to cost more than 2.5 times the original contract, nearly 250 million. Can you imagine coming home and telling your wife or partner or husband, I've just bought a new car. The garage was selling it for £10,000, but I told them I'd happily pay £20,000 and I'll pick it up maybe this year or maybe next or maybe the year after that. Even in this debate, Mr Wheelhouse's response to the ferries fiasco still appears to be in line with other SNP debacles. Oops, we'll try again, maybe learn some lessons, just like the Minister's R100 broadband failure. However, he should not be alone in shouldering the blame, as the then Finance Secretary Derek Mackay is also responsible for handing out loans to Fergus Marine whenever they came calling. This is the gentleman who promised to nationalise the yard without even knowing how much it was going to cost. And then we had Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, saying how proud she was last August of the progress that had been made since the Scottish Government took control. Does she not realise the ferries have not been delivered yet and are costing more than double the original contract? The Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee at Holyrood has already said the procurement process is not fit for purpose, but the Scottish Government pressed ahead regardless, despite the risks involved. The committee found that Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, the Scottish Government's procurement body, and Transport Scotland's due diligence was inadequate. But why should we be surprised of all of this? It's not exactly the first time the SNP government have been woefully shown up. Take the Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh, which cost £150 million, yet still it's going to open late. And only after an extra £16 million was ploughed into rectified faults with the ventilation. What makes it worse is this government doesn't appear to listen. Ask the islanders who patiently waited and are waiting for these new ferries. Government ministers ignored their advice that the proposed ferries were not fit for purpose. Islanders arguing that they were too big. Indeed, it was only after the contract was signed did the Scottish Government realise they would have to spend another £50 million on the quayside infrastructures in order that the ferries could in fact dock. As the Shadow Minister for Rural Affairs and Natural Environment, I know how important these ferries are for the local economies who rely on them heavily. It provides remote communities with a vital lifeline to the rest of the country. Concerns have already been voiced over the overall age profile of Scotland's ferry fleet, with many now operating beyond their expected lifespan. Indeed, around 50% of the CalMac fleet is now beyond its 25-year expectancy, with inevitable breakdowns and cancelled sailings being experienced. So it should not be forgotten how critical these new state-of-the-art ferries are. It's just a pity the sheer incompetence of this SNP government has left our island communities paddling upstream without a paddle. Rather than you and your arrogant government burying your heads in the sand and learning nothing from the committee report, the government, and you in particular, Mr Wheelhouse, should hang your head in shame.
I call Angus MacDonald to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to take part in this afternoon's debate, not just as a member of the REC Committee, but also as a regular user of CalMac ferries, not least the MV Hebrides, which is patiently waiting to be replaced by vessel 802. Now, we all know that Ferguson's has had a history of building good quality ships for the CalMac fleet on time and on budget for decades. Indeed, it's because of that quality of workmanship that there hasn't been the massive outcry you would expect on the islands of Lewis or Harris over the delay in delivering vessel 802, because the current MV Hebrides is such a good ship, faithfully plying the Uig Triangle day in, day out, weather permitting. And of course, it's worth remembering she was built by Ferguson's 20 years ago and is still going strong. In fact, she's probably the best ship in the CalMac fleet. So the proof is there that Ferguson's has delivered in the past excellent fit-for-purpose ships for the fleet, up until, that is, FML appeared on the scene. But there is clearly some disquiet on the islands at the prospect of further delay and the 802 not coming into service until between December 2022 and February 2023, not helped, of course, by the COVID pandemic, which has delayed work in the ferries by a further 6 months. So turning to the committee's report itself, with regard to the procurement and construction strategy, the committee was extremely concerned about the overall age profile of Scotland's ferry fleet, with many vessels now operating significantly beyond their originally planned lifespan. We considered that the current situation reflects a failure by successive administrations in Scotland to develop and implement an effective strategy for renewing the fleet. So to that end, I was delighted to see in the Minister's recent response to the committee that the government will invest at least £580 million during the next 5 years to build on their vessel replacement and deployment plans, which we're assured will improve resilience, reliability, capacity and accessibility. Looking to the future, and in particular engagement with local island communities, During their evidence sessions, both CMAL and CalMac claimed strong levels of engagement, with Robbie Drummond of CalMac stating that they undertake hundreds of meetings per year with local ferry committees and ferry stakeholder groups. And Jim Anderson of CMAL stated that engagement with local communities has been extensive, and that the design of vessels 801 and 802 were responsive to the needs and expectations of those local communities as a result. With specific reference to 802, Mr Anderson claimed, and I quote, "The communities are by and large getting the ship that they want. The ship is like the MV Hebrides, and we know that they're very happy with the Hebrides. I would say that the ship will be Hebrides Plus when it's finished," which was music to my ears, convener, but sadly not to Corner, Nail and Shears, which claimed that offering a vehicle deck capacity increase of 25% compared to the vessel it's replacing, vessel 802 will only partially alleviate capacity issues on the Uig Triangle. It also suggests the decision to provide the service with a single new vessel was contrary to the preference of the local community, which reminds me of the situation with the now 6-year-old MV Loch Seaforth. The community originally wanted 2 smaller ferries operating the Stornoway-Telepool route instead of the one larger ferry that they got. It's fair to say that there's still room for improvement when it comes to engagement with local communities, and I'm glad the Minister has acknowledged that. In closing, Presiding Officer, it should not go unnoticed that the Scottish Government, which faced an unprecedented and most unwelcome predicament, which I'm sure none of us would envy, took action to secure the future delivery of the vessels to serve the island communities which rely upon them, and also secured hundreds of skilled jobs and wider economic activity. For the record, that is some 350 employees at the yard, including permanent, temporary and contract workers, which also includes 26 apprentices. And of course, the yard also supports an estimated 350 jobs in the rest of Scotland. The saving of one of Scotland's last shipyards cannot and should not be disregarded or undermined. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Alistair Allen, who will be the last open debate speaker.
Presiding Officer, the committee's report is unambiguous. As others have pointed out, there were indeed, it seems, catastrophic failures associated with the building of 2 vessels for CMAL. Some of those failures may be attributed to the process of procurement by CMAL, but many clearly are also attributable to the way in which the project was managed by the contractors then operating Ferguson's. The people not to blame are the workforce of Ferguson's themselves. I'm neither going to minimise all those facts nor rehearse them again. Instead, I want to look at some human consequences. Much of the discussion so far today has very legitimately concentrated on what this episode means for jobs in Inverclyde. Now, given the proud heritage of shipbuilding there, I readily understand and sympathise with that focus. Indeed, it was, I believe, quite right that the government stepped in when it did to save the jobs. However, like Kenneth Gibson, I want to add a word now about what the delay to those vessels actually means for island communities. Vessel 802, which is now running some 4 years behind schedule, is intended for the route that runs from Uig and Skye to the islands of Harris and North Uist in my constituency. CalMac, of course, already has vessels which currently run on those routes. However, because of a period in the first few years of this century when no new major vessels were built for CalMac routes, some of the current fleet, as we have heard, are now becoming distinctly stricken in years. The pressing need for new tonnage to serve island routes becomes strikingly clear in the summer, at least in any normal summer, when CalMac can simply no longer meet hugely increased demand. Less widely highlighted, however, is the problems CalMac and the communities it serves now face in the winter, when the fleet is shuffled around while many vessels have their annual refits. Only at the end of the year, 3 of CalMac's largest vessels were out of action at the same time, meaning that the company could not cover all lifeline services. Only a few combinations of ships and piers are actually interchangeable. Add bad weather or vessel breakdown into the picture, and the situation now becomes extremely difficult to manage. At Easter 2018, for instance, Lochmaddy in North Uist went without any ferry service at all for the holiday long weekend, with a waiting list stretching to nearly 3 weeks. Those kind of sustained ferry problems have significant consequences it can become difficult to keep shops stocked. It can become impossible for families to attend funerals. Tourist businesses are unable to honour bookings. So, Presiding Officer, obvious and unhelpful though it may be for me to say this, I just want to end by observing that with the best will in the world, a Calmac ferry does not take 6 years to build. The nearest comparison that comes to mind is the line of Queen Mary, which took 5.5 years from the laying of her keel to her maiden voyage in 1936. She, however, was then the largest ship in the world, and work had stopped halfway through her construction because of the Great Depression. So, Presiding Officer, I think it would be remiss of me not to take this opportunity to focus at least some of the debate on the need to ensure that these 2 vessels are completed soon, and to ensure that another vessel intended for Isla is ordered, or more importantly completed soon too, in order to ensure that the Calmac fleet can cope in the years that lie ahead.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate has highlighted the fact that there does remain many unanswered questions. That's why so many of the committee's recommendations called for further investigation, for example, by Audit Scotland, and for reviews of the procurement process, the design, development and vessel specifications and propulsion technologies. And as I've already made clear, it's my view that there does need to be further investigation into the decision-making process over the awarding of this contract in the first place. But although there are unanswered questions, there are some unavoidable facts. The building of these ferries it was a catastrophic failure, and in the words of the committee's report, it exposed serious failures in the current tripartite decision-making processes. In calling for an urgent root and branch overhaul of the decision-making structures, we specifically noticed that this should, and I quote, consider the relative roles and responsibilities of all bodies involved in decision-making around the procurement of new vessels, and whether each of these bodies should in fact continue to exist. It's becoming increasingly clear that there is no longer a need for CML. No, we are not subject to EU procurement laws, and their failure to carry out due diligence in the awarding of this contract should hasten that decision. I have to say, a failure that Stuart McMillan says should be swept under the carpet. He says that we should simply keep CML a failing organisation because it creates jobs. He seems not to understand that the jobs will still need to be done, but taking ferry building fully in-house would simplify the procurement process, improve accountability and ensure better alignment with communities' needs and wider government policy aims. I don't know if I've got time to take that. No, very briefly, I think, is the signal. But
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Colin Smith for taking an intervention. At what point, Mr Smith, did I actually say that?
Colin Smith.
You made it absolutely clear, Mr McMillan, that you did not support the scrapping of CML. You actually specifically talked about the jobs that were being created there. And I just wonder, Mr McMillan, how many jobs could be created with £100 million that's been swept into the Clyde because of this ferry fiasco from your government? No. It's vital also. It's vital also. Well, it's a point that Mr McMillan ignored in his speech, but it's absolutely vital. Not only should we look at the structures of the way in which contracts are procured, that ferry building itself should be properly aligned with wider policy, including, I have to say, our ambitious carbon reduction targets. The Scottish Government must look at what more can be done to support low carbon technology in our shipbuilding sector to reduce emissions and create those vital green jobs here in Scotland. There are some exciting projects underway here in Scotland, such as the High Seas 3 project in Orkney, which I understand is seeking funding through the UK Government's Clean Maritime Demonstration Programme. If we're serious about building a green economy, work like this must be supported. And we want to see that supported in shipyards in Scotland. So that brings me on to the future of Ferguson's Marine Shipyard. The Government have been keen to emphasise the role they played in protecting the shipyard's future by bringing it into public ownership. Now, I fully support that decision, but it should never have been allowed to escalate to that point in the first place. It should not, frankly, have been necessary. This fiasco led to the demise of the company behind Ferguson's, not something we should be celebrating, which certainly came across in some members' speeches. It was clear from the committee's inquiry that despite the failings of the management and the financial model for the company itself, that Ferguson's has a dedicated and skilled workforce, making it an invaluable asset to Scotland's shipbuilding industry and an important source of jobs in the local economy. Having made that welcome initial intervention to save the yard, the focus must now be to work to protect its long-term future by investing in and developing the skills and expertise the yard has and ensuring it is equipped to deliver the cutting-edge green technology we will need, and it secures the contracts that it can deliver. We need a joined-up strategic plan for shipbuilding and ferry services in Scotland. As well as revisiting the procurement process for the shipbuilding process, the Scottish Government also needs to set up plans for awarding contracts for lifeline ferries. But the Government does need to learn the mistakes from this fiasco. But for that to be possible, I have to say to the Minister, the Government cannot continue to be so dismissive of so many of the committee's recommendations. It should remember fundamentally that what we have in this contract is £100 million of taxpayers' money wasted, and most importantly, we have lifeline ferry services not being delivered to communities that have had to wait far too long for the delivery of this contract.
Thank you. I now call Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This debate comes at an important time following the REC Committee's report. And can I thank the members, clerks, the convener, my colleague Edward Mountain, for what was a clear and comprehensive examination of this subject. As a new member of the REC Committee, I didn't participate in the work that's taken place over the last year. However, as an islander, I'm all too aware of the issues that our ferry networks have faced. At the heart of all of this are 2 vessels and hundreds of tons of steel sitting on the banks of the Clyde. It's a story as tragic as it is ridiculous. It all started quite differently. The easy promises, the First Minister's launch of the Glen Sannox in 2017, with only the Potemkin-esque painted windows hinting at the trouble ahead amongst the sea of little flags issued to schoolchildren. But instead of sailing the clear waters of the Clyde and Hebrides, as they ought to now be, what the Scottish Government has created is a pair of grandiose monuments to their own incompetence. And our island communities, not to mention the taxpayer, have been left with the consequences. The committee's report in December was damning. And those 2 words, repeated many times today, catastrophic failure, should haunt all those responsible. The report told a tale not only of enormous delays and cost overruns, but of huge flaws from the start to the end of the procurement process, missed opportunities for the Scottish Government to mitigate problems at earlier stages, and a deaf ear turned to concerns from numerous parties. Over the summer, the Glen Sannox was pulled into dry dock, its frame having been left exposed to the elements too long and remedial action needed. Glasgow has the fish that never swam, Port Glasgow, the ship that's never sailed. Since the tide so publicly turned on the project, the Scottish Government has created a legacy of evasion, trying to shift blame at every opportunity, suggestions that it was all the fault of Ferguson Marine, with innocent ministers the real victims, dissolved under the light of the committee's investigation. And my colleague Graham Simpson highlighted that as he spoke about the Scottish Government's response to the report and the Minister's lack of humility or acceptance of the lessons to be learned. But Paul Wheelhouse can no longer ignore a 5-year delay and a 9-figure overspend. Given his record with these ferries, the broadband rollout and the proposed publicly owned energy company, the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands is fast gaining a reputation as the Minister for Delays. But of course, as Finlay Carson and others rightly pointed out, Paul Wheelhouse isn't the only politician with questions to answer. He's just one of the SNP ministers involved in this shameful affair. And stay-at-home politician Derek Mackay should be here too, or at least joining us remotely, to answer questions. But he isn't. And Peter Chapman took up the gulf between the committee's findings and the report and the government's response. Significantly, the issues around Transport Scotland and CMAL's oversight and due diligence have been a constant theme of discussions. He also mentioned an issue that I know is close to the hearts of islanders, and businesses especially, resilience. Ferry services that cannot adapt when normal operations break down, and where faults lead inevitably to lost journeys. Presiding Officer, what today's debate has shown is the lack of strategic planning within the Scottish Government for our ferries, an issue I've raised in this chamber for many years. These ferries are vital to our island communities and should be driven by the needs of islanders. As the committee notes with some alarm, the ageing profile of our ferry fleet, that lack of built-in resilience and the short-termist approach that has been taken. We see it too in the Northern Isles, with still no answers from the Scottish Government on the future of the inter-island ferries that will themselves need replacement. All the while, private operators seem to be able to commission new vessels on time and on budget. And the fear is this: so long as these long-standing issues remain unanswered, surely it will only be a matter of time before the SNP's next catastrophic failure comes along.
Thank you. I now call on Paul Wheelhouse.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And after that kind of underwhelming contribution from Jamie Halker-Johnson, I will not take any lessons from someone who pulled less than 500 votes to get into this Parliament about Julian Fellows need not look out for any fear that he'll be replaced as a Tory scriptwriter for lines. In respect of other contributions, I would like to more positive contributions. Rhoda Grant raised, I appreciate is online and cannot contribute, and Stuart Stevenson raised issues to do with state aids and the replacement to that. It's clear, yes, there is a different environment now post-Brexit, but we also have to take into account that we need guidance from UK Government around how the subsidy arrangements will now be made before we can start to draw conclusions about the implications for direct award, although we clearly are interested in looking at that. There are a number of other positive contributions. Colin Smith, I appreciate much of what you said may be less positive, but I think he was calling for a tripartite review as others were. I just wanted him to acknowledge, and others colleagues to acknowledge, we have committed to that. It is about to be commissioned. It will report to Parliament and to ministers, and I reassure him and others that I'm not sure I have time, but if the Presiding Officer allows me, I can absolutely.
Graham Simpson.
Can I thank the Minister for taking the intervention? Are there any circumstances under which he would consider scrapping CMAL?
Paul Wheelhouse.
In terms of the point that Graham Simpson raised, we obviously have to commission the review and see what comes forward. I am praising the work that CMAL and CalMac and Transport Scotland do. I acknowledge there are lessons to be learned. I have said that in my opening remarks and in my written submission. We will learn the lessons, I promise that. But we also need to wait for that review to conclude what are the ideal arrangements given the kind of procurement models we need to look at going forward and to try and get the investment in the fleet. So I think with respect to him, I understand what he's trying to get me to say, but we have to see what is recommended as the best organisational structure going forward to ensure that we have the appropriate steps in place. Alistair Allen was right to focus on the communities, and I hope he would acknowledge, as would Kenny Gibson and others, that I have been in contact with communities, and I have given them absolute assurance we're doing everything we can to get vessels in place in time, and expressed my regret that they are facing delays as a consequence of what's happened at Ferguson's. Mike Rumbles charged us with the risk that this report will sit on a shelf and gather dust. I can assure him it will not. We're already acting on a number of the recommendations now. And I would hope that even the convener acknowledged some areas he welcomed in his opening remarks, including our willingness to contribute to any Audit Scotland review, should that be asked for by Audit Scotland. And indeed, I don't think I have time, Presiding Officer, so apologies, but I will happily engage with a member afterwards. In terms of the wider contributions, we have certainly signalled, as I say, that we remain committed to those communities and to take on board lessons. We've recognised the impact the delays have had. We've given additional investment to CalMac through CMAL for £4 million a year to help with additional maintenance costs as we try to bridge the gap between the vessels arriving. And in recent months, we've also made significant progress around other key vessel replacement projects, with the appointment of naval architects for the Gourock to Dunoon and Kilcreggan vessels, approval of initial stages of the small vessel replacement programme that will see 7 of the Loch-class vessels replaced in a rolling programme. In addition, CMAL have commenced work on the options around replacing the freight vessels for the Northern Isles. Our infrastructure investment plan that Angus MacDonald referenced has committed to £580 million in investment in ferries over the next 5 years. And we're also looking at whether or not there are positive lessons we can take from the impact of COVID on services, and in particular considering, not least inspired by discussions with Dr Allen and colleagues in the Western Isles, about retention of an appropriate percentage of tickets on a turn-up-and-go basis, whether that should continue, which is of more benefit to islanders looking to travel at short notice, given capacity constraints. And I make these points to stress that whilst we will reflect and improve, as I've set out, we'll also progress these vital projects. And some of this work may also require port infrastructure improvements to support the introduction of new vessels with larger capacity and to accommodate standardisation of vessels, which is something the committee and witnesses have called for. And that references a point that John Finney made in his remarks at the beginning. But these costs will be understood through the development of the project and tested against a detailed cost-benefit analysis across the lifetime of a vessel's life. We're also committed to ensuring this work is underpinned by an overall investment strategy that considers both ports and vessels and support all of this with the development of the Island Connectivity Plan. I think the convener mentioned this earlier on. That will be the successor to the current ferries plan and will look more comprehensively at connectivity for islanders to the mainland. And we continue to welcome the commitment and professionalism of the workers and management team in the yard at Port Glasgow, and will update the committee at appropriate intervals around the progress with completion of both hulls 801 and 802, and we firmly stand behind our decision to step in and ensure jobs for Inverclyde, a future for the business, and to ensure that vessels are delivered. And Stuart McMillan is absolutely right to focus on that. Presiding Officer, as part of the intervention, we have very reluctantly accepted the additional cost brought about by the failure of the contractor to deliver on the fixed price they promised, underpinned by failures in processes by the former management, as set out in the report of the turnaround director when the yard was brought into public control. That does not mean, though, that we do not accept things have to change. So I accept members are making these points, but we have acknowledged that, even in my written submission to the committee, we have acknowledged that we are not entirely resting this on contractor failure, but it was, as I say in my contribution, a very significant factor in the problems that have unfolded, and I hope members who are fair-minded would accept that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I call on Maureen Watt to wind up on behalf of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. Mike Rumbles.
Presiding Officer, you will be aware I made a point of order last week on the inability to make interventions, obviously, when people are making a remote contribution. And I asked whether you would take that forward, and you suggested we give it, bring it to the attention of our business managers. Similarly, today, we've got an issue that the Bureau, again, have programmed this debate. It's a really important debate in a very short period of time, meaning that members, other than the front bench, can only contribute 4 minutes, and quite rightly, they don't have time to take interventions. This is not a debate. The Parliament is turning into a process of speech after speech after speech. This is not a debate, and I would really hope that the Business Bureau takes note of this.
Thank you very much. I'm not at all sure this is a point of order, but in any case, it is important to say that what the Bureau proposes, Parliament agrees or disagrees, and the timing for this debate was agreed by Parliament. I call on Maureen Watt to close for the committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I hope that intervention hasn't eaten into my time. This has obviously been a robust debate on the Rural Economy and Connectivities report, which had to be debated in this chamber. And while there's been mentioned that there wasn't a minority report, it would be fair to say that there was robust discussion and disagreement in the committee, and it's thanks to the clerks that we managed to get to this point to help us in our work to have this report, and I thank them for it. Holding an inquiry was agreed by the committee, and it's rightly so, because there's a considerable amount of taxpayers' money involved in ferries generally, and specifically with 801 and 802. And as members have said, many of our island communities are and will be affected by the slippage in the procurement of new ferries in what is an ageing fleet. The Government and the Minister must accept that changes are necessary, and I'm pleased that consultation, for example, with islanders will be improved, and above all, that feedback is necessary for them. It's a very important part of the process of engagement, and the wants of islanders are not some homogeneous ask, and the needs of the wider economy, such as tourism and business, all need to be factored in. The Scottish Government must look to have standard designs for small, medium and large vessels to get economies of scale, and to have better coordination of key sizes and key facilities throughout the Western Isles and the Northern Isles, so that we can take into account the various needs of islanders, but have some coordination and standardisation, especially as propulsion methods will change going forward to take into account climate change. It really was important to have this debate, to hear the contributions from those who represent the islands in our country. And it is important to say that tendering and procurement of ships is unique, And there has been a long-standing process, and it's unlikely to change significantly just because of ferries. But there is room for better design specification and the requirements in the tenders to be more specific. We do want a shipbuilding industry to survive in this country. It has been a consensus throughout this debate. And I think it would be unthinkable not to have a vibrant shipbuilding capacity in Scotland, which is an island and has lots of island communities to serve. It's clear that Ferguson Shipyard, as long as it is in public hands, will be a subject for debate in future parliaments, and that government should be held to account on this subject. There is much to be done to turn around this business, and it will take many years to put it on a sound financial footing. And the government is right to look forward, but it is important that we question the current decision-making structure, especially, for example, the length of the CalMac contract. It should be longer. However, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, those speakers who also visited the yard cannot but have seared in their memories what we saw as a result of FEMA's tender of the yard. Parts and machineries of the vessel stored in appalling conditions without sufficient inventory in place, steel of insufficient quality to hold the bow doors in place, capstans of insufficient strength to hold the ships in port, no pipework from the LNG tanks to the engine room, not to mention the infamous bulbous bow, all having to be replaced at huge cost due to the incompetence and negligence of FEMA. All in all, Scotland must, as I've said, have a sustainable shipbuilding industry, and in Inverclyde we must have a yard that's in a position to be competitive. Inverclyde, as Stuart McMillan has said, is one of the most deprived areas in Scotland, and it's really important that this government continues to support that yard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on the inquiry into construction and procurement of ferry vessels in Scotland, and we will move on in a moment to the next item of business.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.